Good evening, my friends. Tonight, let your shoulders soften and your thoughts grow quiet because we're going somewhere very old. We're traveling to Japan, not the Japan of neon streets and busy trains, but a Japan that existed before there were even mountains to cast shadows. A Japan still asleep inside the dark, waiting to be called into shape by gods whose names sound like the first breath the world ever took. This is where Japanese mythology begins, with nothing and with everything. Before there were islands or oceans, before even the idea of sunrise, there was a gentle darkness. Not an empty, frightening pit, but a kind of patient night. It was neither cold nor warm, neither tight nor vast. It simply was. Within that calm, all things that might ever exist rested together, tangled like threads in a skein that had not yet been woven. Time had not learned to move. Space had not learned to stretch. It was as if the universe was holding its breath, waiting for someone to whisper, "Begin." Slowly, the stillness started to tilt. The lightest parts of that potential, too fine to sink, began to rise. The heaviest parts, thick and slow, began to drift downward. What rose became the high plane of heaven, a realm so clear that even the faintest shadow could not hold on. What sank became the central reed plain, a soft, shifting world like a wet field, bending and trembling, trying to decide what it wanted to be. Between them lay a hazy middle, a misty corridor of possibility that had not yet chosen a direction. In that tender separation, the first gods appeared. They did not arrive with thunder or the crash of wings. They did not crawl out of oceans or fall from stars. They simply were. They stood up from the fabric of existence itself, like thoughts that suddenly understood they had a shape. These early deities were pure intention, minds that could set down the rules of reality long before there were suns or moons to obey them. Among them was the Lord of the august center of heaven, motionless and calm, like the still point around which everything else might someday turn. Beside him, unseen but deeply felt, were the divine generators, beings whose very presence felt like an inhale and an exhale. They needed no parents, no births, no childhoods. They were complete from the instant they appeared, self-made and self-sustained. For a time, they watched over this newborn arrangement of light and heavy, pattern and possibility, laying down the invisible laws that would one day become gravity, growth, and the slow turning of seasons. And when their first work was done, they did not die. They simply receded, like a gentle tide sliding away from a polished shore, leaving the sand ready for new footprints. More gods rose in quiet groups, one after another, like knots forming along a long, invisible rope. They were not yet the gods of storms or seas or fire. They were foundations, structures in the unseen, the supporting beams of a world that was still deciding on its face. They tied heaven and earth together in ways no mortal eye would ever see, making sure that whatever came next would have something solid to rest upon. As generations of deities unfolded, the universe's attention narrowed, as if focusing on a single necessary task. The shaping of the land itself could not be left to distant, abstract minds. It needed gods who could lean close, who could notice small things. The curve of a coastline, the balance of mountain and valley, the hush of a forest that might someday shelter human footsteps. And so the creative burden passed along this divine lineage until it came to rest on a particular pair. They were called Izanagi and Izanami, he who invites and she who invites. Their names sounded like ceremonial steps taken across a temple floor. They were not lovers in the way humans understand love, not at first. They did not meet by chance or choose each other out of longing. They were chosen, appointed by a council of gods who looked down at the unsettled world and saw something almost ready, almost complete. The high plane of heaven needed builders with courage and care. The central reed plane needed parents. Between heaven and earth there existed a bridge that was not quite a bridge. It was not a carved beam, not a woven rope. It was more like a path of presence, a place that hung above the shifting world like a thought hovering just before being spoken. This was the floating bridge of heaven. It did not rest upon pillars or clouds. It simply stretched there, where the seen and the unseen brushed against each other. It was here that Izanagi and Izanami stood, their robes stirring in a breeze that had not yet learned which way to blow. Around them there was no sun, no moon, only a soft, indirect glow, the faint awareness that one day light and darkness would take turns ruling the sky. Into Izanagi's hands the elder gods placed a spear. As it was no ordinary weapon. Its shaft was wrapped in jewels that did not flash like knives of light but glowed with a deep, patient radiance, as if they contained memories of a dawn that had not yet come. This was the heavenly jeweled spear, a tool meant not to destroy but to shape. Its point was said to know the heart of chaos, to feel where form could be coaxed out of formlessness. Beneath the floating bridge the world churned. It was sea and not sea, motion and murmur, something like water and yet not water at all. It moved like the skin of some enormous creature lost in a dream. Within that swirling softness, the bones of land slept, waiting for someone to touch them, to invite them awake. Izanagi and Izanami leaned forward, listening to that half-formed world the way a midwife listens for the first cry of a child. Together, they lowered the jeweled spear until its tip broke the surface of the chaos. They did not jab or stab. They stirred, gently at first, small circles, patient spirals. Then, as the rhythm settled into their bodies, they stirred more firmly, as if weaving threads through a loom that was finally ready to work. When they lifted the spear again, it came up heavy with shining drops. Thick, glowing beads slid from the tip and fell back into the swirling mass below. Each drop struck the churning surface and clung to itself, pulling more of the vague substance together. As it thickened, gathered, rose, what had been only motion began to become shape. Slowly an island emerged. It was the first solid thing under heaven, a mound of forming earth, trembling but determined to exist. Izanagi and Izanami watched as it decided itself into being, pulling its edges in, hardening its back against the formless sea. When it was ready, they gave it a name, Onagoro, a place that formed on its own. A place that chose to be a place. The gods stepped down from the floating bridge of heaven onto this damp new land. The soil was still young, soft under their feet, as if it had not quite learned the difference between mud and stone. At the center of Onagoro, they raised a pillar. It grew tall and slender, like a reed determined to touch the unreachable ceiling of the sky. This pillar was more than decoration. It was an axis, a spine for the new world, and the first hint of architecture, a statement that space could be shaped, not just floated through. Around this pillar, Izanagi and Izanami performed a sacred rite. They walked in circles, moving in opposite directions, tracing invisible patterns in the air. One went clockwise, the other counterclockwise, weaving an unseen knot that bound them to the pillar, to the land, and to each other. As they passed, they spoke words of greeting, voices brushing together for the first time. Those words did not echo off stone buildings or canyon walls. They fell upon the ears of the newborn earth itself. As it was the first time the world had ever heard speech. Yet even gods can falter. Their first attempt at union produced a child who could not stand, a fragile, unfinished being. Within that child lay the shape of an island, but it was not right, weak, unstable, unfit for living. The island drifted away across the surface of the waters like a piece of broken dream, and sorrow grew in the hearts of the divine pair. As they returned to the elder gods bearing their shame and their questions. There, in the quiet gravity of the heavenly council, the mistake was understood. Form, they were told, has etiquette. Creation is not only power, it is also order. The words spoken during the ritual must follow a pattern. If one speaks out of turn, if the balance of greeting is broken, then harmony itself is bruised, and what is born will carry that bruise. So Izanagi and Izanami went back to Onagoro. The pillar waited, patient as always, stretching between earth and the idea of heaven. Once more they circled it, one to the left, one to the right, feet marking slow paths in the damp soil. This time when they crossed, they spoke in the proper order. The right settled into place like a key finally turned the right way in a stubborn lock. When they came together after that corrected ceremony, the land answered. From the surrounding seas and mists, a new island rose, then another. They did not burst forth in a single violent moment, the way sparks fly from a struck stone. They emerged like a family waking one by one from sleep. The first came Awaji, long and gentle, stretching itself like a narrow creature between waters that would one day know boats and storms. Then Shikoku, shaped with quiet facets, promising forests and hills yet to grow. As after them came Oki and Kyushu and Iki, each with its own temperament written into coastline and curve. Tsushima surfaced, watching distant shores. Sado followed, carrying its own quiet stories in the bones of its cliffs. And at last, Honshu, the largest, the backbone of the archipelago, rose from the deep, rolling its shoulders beneath the empty sky as if testing how it would feel to cradle rivers, cities, and the footsteps of countless generations. Across these islands, patterns began to settle. Rivers learned where they wished to flow, carving secret paths from mountain to sea. Winds discovered the pleasure of circling peaks and slipping through valleys. The shorelines curled and stretched, drawing delicate brackets around futures that had not yet been imagined. Izanagi and Izanami did not stop with islands. The work of creation had only just begun. As they moved across this young, scattered land, ready to give it texture, mountains and plains, storms and blossoms, darkness and light. And somewhere ahead, waiting like a hidden ember in the fabric of their story, were the children they would bring into the world. Gods of sea and storm, of moon and sun, and a radiant goddess whose light Japan would carry in its heart for ages to come. A creation did not slow after the birth of the islands, it deepened. As Izanagi and Izanami walked the young world, the very air around them seemed eager to take shape. With each step they breathed out new deities, the way a forest breathes mist at dawn. The firstborn of this new wave of spirits were the keepers of movement, gods who would live in the pulse of tides and hide in the curling breath of fog. Others settled into mountain thrones or folded themselves into the hush of valleys, becoming the bones of the land itself. Marshes gained their own quiet watchers, ferns unfurled beneath the gaze of gentle spirits. Even the bark on every tree was granted its protector, and the sap that climbed through trunks like liquid memory carried a deity in its shimmering rise. Then came the gods of craft and sustenance, spirits who taught humanity how to weave fiber, how to coax rice into soft green stalks, how to tame water into dikes and terraces so the future could feed itself. Guardians of thresholds appeared, silent watchers of doorways and roads. Even the humblest roof tile gained a spirit who would one day listen to human whispers beneath sleep. Soon their growing catalogue of gods became a living mural, strokes of intention, color, and breath being laid across the world like paint across a scroll. Onogoro, once the lone island in the vast primordial sea, now stood at the heart of a rising realm. Its palace filled with shimmering presences, gods in their first youth, eager to take their places in a world still half-dream. But creation is a sweet intoxication with a hidden price. Even divine hands grow weary. Izanagi and Izanami paused to rest between labors, marveling at the world they had coaxed from chaos. Oceans learned tides. Rivers intertwined in braids across plains. Forests lifted layered canopies that stretched like green cathedrals. Cranes rehearsed dances that would one day guide the stories of poets. Night still lacked its full velvet, and day had not yet learned to blaze, but their time was coming. Yet beneath this beauty, something darker coiled in Izanami's body. She felt it first as a heat, sharp and rising, unlike any birth she had ever known. Creation had gifted her many children, but this one carried a warning in its flames. As the world sensed it too, winds stilled, rivers hesitated, even the young gods fell quiet listening. When the child emerged, light blazed through her body, too bright, too fierce. It was as if the sun had chosen her womb as its doorway. As the newborn god wailed and the sound cracked the air. His name was Kagutsuchi, the spirit of fire. But fire is a gift that demands something in return. On the moment of his first breath, heat scorched the mother who bore him. Izanami collapsed, pale as ash. Her robes shriveled at their edges, her lips split from the blistering kiss of her child. Flames clung to the room like hungry spirits, and a silence fell over Onogoro so heavy it bent the rafters. Izanagi held the burning child, torn between awe and horror. Love twisted painfully inside him, a love for the wife slipping away, and a love for the child blazing in his arms, both divine, both doomed. And grief makes even a god lose himself. In a storm of anguish and fury, Izanagi drew his blade. He acted not as a creator, but as a husband drowning in helplessness. With one stroke, he ended Kagutsuchi's life. The fire god's body split, and from the spraying blood, new divine forces erupted. Wherever the crimson struck earth, mountains rose, molten and strong. Rivers burst forth. The spirits of ore and forge awakened, destined to teach humanity the secrets of steel. Creation bloomed even in tragedy, but sorrow does not pause to admire its offspring. Izanagi rushed back to Izanami's side. She was not cold, only drifting, as though her body had become a boat floating toward a shore he could not see. Attendants had arranged her hair and wrapped her in soft garments, but nothing could hide the shadow settling over her face. A darkness not cruel but final, he whispered to her as gods whisper when they are afraid. He reminded her of the seas that still needed her guidance, of the mountains waiting for her counsel. He confessed his fault, voice cracking. He promised her stars if only she would stay. But Izanami was already listening to a distant sound, a tide moving beneath the world. And then she crossed. The land of the dead, not yet twisted by judgment or fear, welcomed her like dusk welcomes the horizon. It was a realm of soft return, where day and night blurred into a quiet afterglow. She moved through its threshold as though descending a twilight beach. The water she touched was not wet. The light that met her was neither sunrise nor shadow. And when she glanced back once, the film of Yomi was already sealing over her gaze. No hand can grasp that border, not even the hand that shaped islands from chaos. Onagoro fell silent. The gods of wind dimmed their songs. River spirits hid their music under stones. Izanagi felt grief carve itself into him. But grief is a strange tutor. It teaches that the world goes on, sand still remembers each footstep only long enough to forget it. Rice still stretches toward the sun no matter who is missing. But Izanagi was not ready to be wise, he was a husband. And so he made a choice that shook the young world's spine. He would break the gate between life and death. He would descend into Yomi. He would bring her back. Resolve flared inside him, a flame that burned without heat. He followed its glow along shorelines where waves whispered warnings, through ravines thick with ferns and rust-scented air, into caverns whose breaths were not his own. Down he went until the living world faded to a faint hum behind him. Ahead stretched the trembling hush of the underworld, a sound shaped like a hallway of sealed doors. The entrance to Yomi was not a door at all, but the absence of one, a passage that had stopped halfway into becoming. Izanagi stepped into its cool breath. His footsteps grew soundless. Light faded into eyelid shadow, then even that collapsed. He walked by the memory of her hand. He called her name. It rang like a bell buried in snow. Faint voices answered, perhaps water, perhaps grief whispering to itself. He called again. Something turned toward him. She stood there. Not as she had been, not the bright woman who had laughed beside him on Onagoro. In this dusk she was changed, dimmed by the laws of Yomi, but she was still her. His heart jolted like a struck drum. He reached for her. As she stepped back, her voice was soft, muffled by the air of the dead. She explained the food of Yomi binds all who taste it. She had eaten. A covenant now held her to this place. As she wished to return, but the law was older than the gods themselves. She would plead her case to the rulers of Yomi, but until she secured permission, he must not look upon her. Promise, she whispered, and he did. But promises made in darkness require a patience that even gods struggle to hold. He waited until silence thickened around him, stretching into something that felt like eternity. Fear seeped into the cracks of his resolve. As at last, trembling, he broke the promise. He lifted the torch he had hidden, a spark bloomed, light crawled across the room, and then it revealed her. The woman he loved stood before him, transformed by death. Her skin was veiled with shadows hanging like heavy vines. Small thunder spirits perched in her hair, their faces clenched. Secrets gnawed inside her mouth. The beauty he remembered warred with something terrible and ancient. And the world shuddered between them. What he saw in that stolen light did not cut his flesh, but it cut his certainty. The cry that tore out of him was not the shout of a warrior. It was the startled, breaking sound of someone watching love turn into something they cannot recognize. That sound stirred Yomi. The house of the dead awoke around him. Its wardens rose like shadows shaken from walls. And on the far side of that dim place, Izanami felt his gaze as if it were a knife slid carefully between her ribs. As in the world above, a chase ends at a fence or at a cliff or in the exhaustion of lungs. In the world below, a chase ends at stone. Izanagi ran. Behind him came the guardians of Yomi, their movements heavy and tireless, the air rippling around them. As in their hands they carried the tools of hunger. In their mouths, frogs croaked out the cold, thick music of the underworld. His little flame trembled at the tip of the torch, smearing light across roots and rock as he fled. His every step seemed to echo too loudly, as if the darkness itself were listening. He reached the place where the passage of the world narrows, the throat between realms. Here the earth's veins tightened into a cramped corridor. In that constriction waited a stone. It was not just a stone, but the idea of closure made solid. A law-given weight. With a desperate force, Izanagi pulled the huge boulder free and dragged it into place. He wedged it between this world and the one that chased him. The guardians crashed against it, beating and clawing with the ritual fury of beings who know they must continue even when the outcome is already decided. On one side of the stone, Izanagi stood panting, ash on his fingers and the echo of Yomi still clinging to his skin. On the other side, Izanami stood with the terrible calm of someone whose grief had hardened into a crown. As she spoke through the rock, her voice was low, but it carried the weight to bend metal and memory. She told him that he had shamed her by breaking his promise, by forcing his eyes upon what should have remained hidden. She told him that because of that betrayal, she would drag 1,000 living souls down into the dark every single day. He pressed his palm against the cold surface, feeling the thinness and the thickness of that barrier all at once. His answer rose from a place in him that was both fury and iron will. "Then I will cause 1,500 births each day," he said, "so that life will always outnumber death." Between those two sentences, spoken on either side of a rock lodged between worlds, the balance of existence was set. We live beneath the edge of that bargain even now. He left the stone where it lay door and wall together and began the long climb back through the body of the earth. He rose through tunnels that remembered his footsteps, through caverns still tasting of torches and regret, until he emerged into the open air. The sun draped itself over his shoulders like a cloak. He did not look up into it. He carried with him what all travelers bring back from the underworld, the faint scent of endings, the dust of places where names no longer stick to things. He was unclean. A god's impurity is not like a mortal's, but stain is stain. It clings, it speaks. It changes how the world answers when you call. So he walked until he reached a river that knew how to forget. The water slid past with the calm of something that had watched countless footprints vanish from its banks. At the edge, Izanagi began to shed what he had worn in Yomi. His cloak, thick with the breath of the dead, fell to the ground, and as it fell, spirits shivered loose from its folds. The band that held his hair came away, and from the curve of that simple circle, a deity stepped out as if it had been waiting all along inside the knot. He removed his sandals, and tiny gods climbed free from the pressed straw. Even the dust that shook from his garments did not simply disappear. It rose into the air, took new form, and settled into the unseen order of things. His very act of disrobing became sowing, a handful of seeds thrown into the furrows of a world still learning what could grow in it. As at last he stepped into the river, the water closed around his legs with the soft sound of reunion. He lifted it in his hands and touched it to his lips. The taste was everything Yomi was not. It was thin and bright and young. It tasted like beginnings he washed. From the cleansing of his left eye rose a radiant goddess, light gathered into a form that carried daylight under its skin. She did not simply shine, she commanded brightness. When he washed his right eye and flung the water upward, a calmer presence emerged, pale, watchful, and slow, with the measured grace of months sliding across the sky. Last, he exhaled, pushing the last stale breath of the underworld out of his lungs. From that breath stepped a third deity, wild with storms, sea wind tangled in his hair, waves and thunder coiled in his heels. 3 noble children stood on the riverbank as if they had been waiting just out of sight this whole time, only needing their names to be washed loose. The first bore the smile of the sun herself. The second held the bowing composure of the moon. The third stared toward the distant sea, seeing waves already rising like pale-backed animals hungry to race the horizon. Is in that quiet bend of the river the world gained its lights. From that moment the upper air finally had rulers. The sun goddess, bright and fierce, rose to her place in the high plane of heaven. Wherever her gaze went, green things stiffened their spines and reached upward, remembering that growth is not a suggestion but a command. The moon god took his path more softly, learning the hidden steps of night, keeping time with tides and with the private turning of hearts. The Stormbringer claimed the wild waters and the unruly winds, riding their tempers, guiding their destruction, and sometimes their mercy. Izanagi stood on the stones, feeling the last traces of Yomi slide from him like old leaves letting go of a branch. He had lost a wife. From that loss came a grim balance and 3 powerful children. The world is a market that insists on exchange. We hate it, we bargain with it, we live inside it anyway. From that day onward, the making of the world moved into a new order. Sun and moon learned their circuits, tracing invisible patterns across the sky. The islands, which had once only known the grief of their first mother, now tasted the steady comfort of seasons. Cranes rehearsed their winter journeys. Rice practiced the rhythm of flood and retreat. The gods of hills and rivers added new lines to their prayers, lines flavored with apology and hope because they could feel it. Heaven no longer held just scattered powers. It had birthed a court, and a court is never only thrones. It is also arguments and reconciliations, banishments and welcomes, contests that end in laughter and contests that end in blood. Hanagoro watched all of this, its great pillar still reaching for the untouched blue, like a question that refuses to be fully answered. Izanagi turned away from the water's edge and walked on. Somewhere under that same wide sky, on the far side of the stone at Yomi, the woman he had loved now wore the title of queen in a realm of quiet endings. He did not call to her. A promise broken once is not a rope you pull again. Instead, he looked at the place where his children had first stood, at the damp prints their feet had left on the stones, and he understood that his story was no longer just his. As the light would vanish into caves and return, the storm would harm and heal. The moon would walk apart from the sun and teach lovers how to miss each other without forgetting. Already, futures were laning into motion. The gods would laugh and argue and shatter and mend the world as only immortals can. Serpents would drink wine and fall beneath blades. Heroes would be tricked into wisdom they did not ask for. Lands would be offered, taken, and given back. A grandson would descend from the heavens, place his foot upon the soil of the islands, and speak to the fields with an authority that would one day be written into law and into song. For now, the river kept running. Izanagi shook the water from his hair and stood clean in the sun. Clean, but not emptied. Purity cannot erase the shape left by love. It cannot smooth the dent in a pillow where someone once slept or erase the faded pressure of a hand on stone. He carried his sorrow like a pattern carved into wood, a mark meant to be seen and read by those who came after. And they would read it. In that mark would live the reason fathers stand very straight in doorways while mothers teach children that food taken from the wrong table is not a gift, but a chain. The first chapters of every world are chapters of separation. Heaven must separate from earth so each can learn how to be itself. River must part from sea so journeys can have destinations and returns. Life must stand apart from death, even while knowing that the distance between them is both real and razor thin. The stone at the mouth of Yomi is both door and wall. The spear that stirred the first island is both bridge and boundary. The gods who remember this walk carefully. The gods who forget learn with bruises. And we, listening much later, try to pull from their stories a rule or two for our small lives. All of this was pressed into the grain of the world when the first island hardened under the jeweled spear's falling drops. In the minds of the faithful, the palace at the center of Onagoro still stands, its pillar rising like a sentence that never quite ends. The 8 great islands are still named, each one turned on the tongue like a bead warmed by long use. The tale of the fire child is still whispered beside hearths that sometimes forget how dangerous warmth can be. The story of the boulder wedged in the earth's mouth is still murmured under the breath when we say goodbye to those who will not return. From the riverbank, where 3 new radiances rose from the water like dawn startled into early bloom, the story of the world leaned forward. It leaned toward a future shaped by siblings whose tempers and alliances would lash and mend the heavens. It leaned toward a dragon whose many tails would scatter like sparks, toward a sword that would carry loyalty and treachery in equal measure as it passed through centuries of hands. It leaned toward rice fields shimmering in their own gold light and toward shrines built of cedar and silk, places where breath itself felt washed clean. The first breath of creation had been taken. The second approached. The spear had opened the book. The pillar stood upright like a hand keeping the early pages from blowing shut. Grief, however, is a teacher that arrives carrying a lamp made of shadow. When Izanami slipped behind the stone of endings, Izanagi learned the lesson that even gods dread. That loss shrinks all beings, even the ones who stir islands with their hands. The islands he had lifted from the newborn sea still stood obedient, green with promise. But the air on Onagoro tasted faintly of ash, as if the palace itself grieved in quiet. Servants walked softly. The world's pillar rising from the island's heart looked taller, perhaps because he now stood shorter beneath it. It was in that silence, thick and unmoving, that Izanagi resolved to do the impossible. If love had escorted his wife into the country of shadows, then love would cross the threshold after her. He began with signs. In the sanctuaries of the high plain, the elder gods cast lots onto polished stone. The omens drifted downward like pale leaves deciding where to rest. They pointed toward a place where the earth's skin thinned, where the world's breath cooled, and where the border between life and death was a veil rather than a wall. Izanagi wrapped himself in the robes of a traveler and took a staff carved from a tree that remembered storms. Without fanfare, he stepped onto the island's edges. Cliffs whispered in the clean, sharp language only stone knows. Beaches of new sand squeaked beneath his sandals. Gulls circled river mouths arguing in their bright voices. No hymns trailed behind him, no mortal chorus. He walked as only a husband walks toward the last place where love might still answer. The entrance to Yomi is not a gate or a tunnel marked by dread. It is sensed. The wind from the sea faltered and fell still. The insects forgot their rehearsed harmonies. The ground lost its warmth as though the sun had pulled its face away. As ahead, a cleft in a hillside opened, mossy, narrow, ancient. Beyond it, a corridor sloped into patient dark. Izanagi did not call her name. Names are power. He had spent his own once and poorly. He held his breath, steadied his heart, and descended. The passage tested him. The first bend tasted of iron. The second smelled like rain that had promised to fall but never arrived. The third swallowed sound until even his thoughts seemed padded and slow. No guardian stood watch. This was the early Yomi, the original tale where the bold and the grieving walked unchallenged until the land itself judged their worth. He continued until the weight of the earth above pressed like a hand on the crown of his head. And then the corridor opened, not into splendor, not into thrones or torches, but into a plain where color had forgotten its duties. A landscape lit by a light that borrowed from neither sun nor moon. Hills that had once tasted winter but no longer remembered its name. There, in that hushed half-existence, he called for her. Her name rose from his lips like a kite cut from its string, floating upward with no hand left to guide it. A figure moved across that pale quiet. The world tilted slightly, as if remembering an old shape. Izanami stood before him. Veiled by the law of Yomi, wrapped in the dim authority of that realm. Her voice drifted toward him as though pushed through woven reeds. She told him she had eaten the food of Yomi, and to eat in that land is to promise to stay. She begged him to wait while she pleaded her case before the rulers below. He must not look upon her until permission was granted. There were things in Yomi that had no right to be seen by the living. He swore. He meant it. The patience, though, is a high and lonely virtue. He almost mastered it. The stillness grew heavy, first like roof tiles laid upon his chest, then like the whole roof itself. An old fear, stubborn and crawling, crept up inside him. He turned from the appointed place and found a crevice where a root twisted through the wall. He coaxed a spark into life, fed it with shavings from his staff and lifted the flame. Light pushed back the dark, and showed him what love does not wish to know. Izanami, once the radiant mother of gods, stood now as the mistress of endings. Her flesh bore the signature of Yomi. Her beauty had been consumed by a law that digests everything and calls the process sacred. As around her crouched 8 thunder spirits, small, cruel, quick, each nested in a ruined corner of her body. In her mouth pulsed a darkness that had nothing to do with breath. In her hair the dead winds had taken rooms. He cried out. And grief can be so loud that it wakes the dead. The cry scattered across the plain into the buried corridors of that realm. It stirred the guardians. Old stories call them the women of Yomi, but they are less women than the rags of famine given sinew and motion. Their hair is dead grass. Their eyes the dull gloss of lentils boiled too long. They came trotting with sharp, quick, hungry steps. Izanami cried out too, not in sorrow but in fury. A broken promise at the edge of the world is a wound even love will not cover. She commanded the wardens to seize him. Izanagi fled. At first, he fled as a god, sure-footed, swift. Then fear cracked his stride into frantic pieces and he fled as a man. The wardens closed in. From his sleeve he pulled the black headdress of his rank and threw it behind him. As in a heartbeat it blossomed into a vineyard heavy with glistening fruit. The wardens fell upon it, tearing at the clusters with the wild hunger of storms. He ran on. When their chewing dimmed to a murmur, he tore the comb from his hair and flung it upon the paths. It struck the ground and erupted into a grove of bamboo, green, tender, shoot after shoot pushing upward with the stubborn insistence of spring. Again the wardens stopped, feverish to feast. He ran on. But hunger in Yomi is ancient. It does not grow tired. They came after him again, mouths red, a rustle behind them like grave cloth dragged over stone. He climbed a tree that remembered sunlight, but its bark crumbled under his hands. He fell, rolled, staggered upright. Ahead stood a grove with branches bent beneath pale, round fruit. He seized 3 and hurled them behind him, whispering their sweetness by name. The fruit burst. The scent rose sharp and clean. Even shades turn aside for peaches. The wardens recoiled, hissing, curses slipping from their cracked mouths. Izanagi sprinted through the space they left and reached the narrowing of the world. The passage angled upward toward a gray, waiting light. He climbed. As he emerged at a mouth in the earth wider than a city gate. On this side, the air trembled with the faint memory of birds. Behind him, a pressure rose like an army crawling up his spine. He turned. He lifted a stone so vast it seemed the earth had kept it ready for him, and set it into the cleft. When he braced it, the pressure slackened. The push from below stopped. From the other side came a voice, rough as iron filings on the tongue. Izanami named him faithless. She vowed to drag 1,000 souls from the living each day to dine at her tables. Izanagi answered with the stubborn mercy of a creator. Then 1,500 shall be born each day. And between those 2 sentences, spoken across a stone set between 2 realms, the daily arithmetic of the world found its rhythm, the tally of living and dead that still governs every dawn. He stayed with his hands resting on the stone for a long time, feeling the cold seep into his palms. It was not the chill of ordinary rock. It was the coolness of a door that had decided never to open again. Behind that barrier, Izanami had become something the living could no longer touch. Ahead of it, he remained a god moving among unfinished futures. Between them stood the stone, and in that moment he understood. There would be no road back for her, no gentle stitching together of hearth and grave, no miracle in which she stepped once more through a threshold and shook the dust of Yomi from her robes. What there would be instead was balance. Later storytellers gave the stone many names to soften its cruelty. Some called it the Rock of Evenings, as if it were the place where all days go to rest. Others called it the weight against which tears break, the thing you push your face against when weeping has no more words to carry. Names like these are bandages. They do not close the wound, but they keep the air from stinging quite so sharply while time tries to knit something over the exposed heart. He did not go back to Onagoro. He carried the underworld with him, the faint smell of Yomi caught in his hair and robes, like smoke that has decided to live in cloth. Among gods, contact with death is not merely sad. It is a kind of stain. A purity in their language has never meant simple cleanliness or pale color. Purity is readiness. It is the condition of being clear enough that higher powers can speak through you without their voices warping. And Izanagi, who had walked among shadows, was not ready. Not yet. So he turned away from the central pillar of the world and walked toward water. Far from the stone of Yomi's mouth in the sun country of Himyuka, there lay a river at Takebana, clear, cool, and forgetful. Its water slid over stones that did not hold on to what they touched. They let each footprint wash away. They let each fallen leaf go. It was the kind of river that could listen to sorrow and not repeat it. He made for that place. At the bank, he stopped. The air smelled of wet rock and young moss. Birds traced easy lines overhead, unaware that the balance of life and death had just been hammered into place far below their flight. Slowly, Izanagi began to undress the underworld from his body. He slipped off his sandals and set them aside. From the woven reeds of their souls, small spirits uncoiled, stretching themselves like limbs waking from sleep. He loosened his girdle, and from the unknotted cord another presence breathed itself into shape, bare and new. His robe came next, heavy with cave breath and underground dust. As he folded it, deities rose from its creases, light and wandering as fresh breezes. Even his staff, when its end touched earth again, shuddered once and remembered that it too could be divine. The world thickened with watchers. Only then did he step into the river. The water reacted like an old friend surprised by a traveler's sudden return, a small, quiet start, a shiver of recognition around his ankles. The current closed around his legs with a cool, steadying grip. He began to wash. He cleansed his left arm first. As the water slid away, ripples of light clung to the bank, drawing together into a cluster of calmy small guardians, each one tasked with watching over edges. Where path meets field, where hall meets threshold, where certainty meets change. When he washed his right arm, more of them appeared, perching invisibly along the stones like shy birds. Then he lifted water in both hands and poured it slowly over his face. He began with the left eye. The river cupped the sun, caught its light, and flung it back not as glare, but as something warmer and more deliberate. As out of that brightness, a young goddess stepped forth onto the shore. Her posture carried the still, powerful composure of someone who could instruct kings with a single look. She did not burn, she steadied. Her light was the calm noon that makes shadows short and work clear. Her hair seemed bound by the horizon itself, her gaze rising to meet a sky that began to understand it would never again be empty. The water trailed down to her feet and settled there willingly, as if pleased to have reached its final purpose. She spoke her name and the rocks listened. Amaterasu, the one who shines in the plain of heaven. Izanagi washed his right eye next, and the water there did not leap with the same golden eagerness. It deepened instead, cooled, slowed. From it emerged a different glow, the kind of light that tells travelers when it is time to fold their tents and gather their fires closer. A figure rose from this quiet luminance, a god with a face where patience and distance held hands. This was Tsukuyomi, lord of measured nights, teacher of months, the one under whose gaze fishermen would one day learn which evenings welcomed them kindly and which should be left alone. He did not smile, but his presence was not harsh. It was gentleness woven tightly with law, like silk wrapped around steel. Finally, Izanagi drew in one last breath that still tasted of Yomi. He closed one nostril and blew the underworld out through the other, casting that old air away. From that proud, almost defiant gesture, another god took shape. He strode from the mist with steps the length of weather, long, restless, difficult to tether. Around him came the scent of salt spray and the metallic edge of distant rain. His hair moved like a storm front sliding across the sea, and his spirit leapt in recognition each time a wave slapped a rock and then slapped it again for good measure. Susanoo, restless, sea-hearted, storm-crowned. He stamped once and the river bowed around his ankles in brief, respectful turbulence. 3 figures now stood upon the pebbled shore, 2 radiant presences and 1 wild. They were not born from a bed or from a cradle, but from washing, strong children of refusal, proof that even contact with death can be turned into a vow never to let stain rule. They were the children of cleansing, the children of no more. The river seemed to broaden in that moment, as if giving them room. Birds resumed their appointed songs, hopping along branches and letting their throats forget the silence of Yomi. Izanagi looked at the trio and felt something he could live with. His grief did not vanish, but its edges dulled enough to carry without tearing him open each time he breathed. He had lost 1. He had gained 3. For once, the arithmetic did not feel cruel. In a voice that knew how to divide fields and assign work, he named their realms. Amaterasu would rise to Takamagahara, the high heavenly plane, and rule the reaches where clouds learned their shapes and where light decided where to fall. The Tsukuyomi would claim the waxing and waning dark, measuring nights and tending the calm economies of tide and temper. Susanoo would take responsibility for seas and storms, and everything that tested the mettle of ships and the humility of sailors. But the river was not finished with its gifts. Purification, the old chronicles say, gave birth to a whole court of minor gods, threshold watchers and boundary keepers. A goddess for the crossing of rivers, a god who waits at the edge of villages to brush away what clings to those returning. Spirits that oversee drains and gutters, those hidden paths where unwanted water sneaks away. Even these humble seams of the world were granted their guardians. In this theology of edges lies one of the deep colors of the old faith. The sacred does not live only on mountain tops or beneath great pillars. It lurks in seams and transitions, in the exact moment where one thing becomes another. When a road exits a forest and steps into open field, there is a God who watches that step. When a burning fever gradually softens and a child's skin cools, there is a God who marks that invisible crossing and nods. Izanagi stood in that flood of unseen presences and knew the world had been washed and reset. He did not forget Yomi. He did not spit curses at it either. Among the people of the shrines, death is not framed as simple evil. It is weight. It is stain. It demands washing and words, rituals, recitations, so that life can continue without rotting at the edges. When he left the river, he shook his hair, and the last heaviness slid away like a shawl being slipped from tired shoulders. Gratitude stirred in him, sharp and specific. He ordered a shrine to be raised for the peach that had once turned back his pursuers, a small, fragrant kindness that had cut through terror. He commanded rites be kept for the spirits that rise from clothing and tools, reminders even to immortals that what they use and wear deserves respect. Only then did he truly turn his eyes toward what lay ahead. The future now had faces, 3 of them. Amaterasu ascended. Some say she carried with her a mirror in which the world would slowly learn to see itself. They say her seat is white and remembers every promise spoken within its light. Her brightness is not just illumination, it is discipline, a warmth that teaches rice to be generous and cranes to endure quietly, standing in winter fields like lines from a patient poem. Later, her palace would thicken with attendants and intrigues, and her temper would draw both laughter and catastrophe. But at this beginning, she was only purpose sharpened into light. Tsukuyomi moved differently. He did not blaze upward. He stepped sideways into calm sky. He became the arithmetic of the sea's slow breathing and the quiet poet of frost. Under his gaze, fishermen learned which nights could cradle their boats and which would break them. Lovers learned to trust or doubt messages written in silver over their rooftops. Farmers began to sing the names of months as if reciting a list of distant relatives. His was a softer glory than his sister's, but soft glories, well guarded, last a very long time. Susanoo lingered at the shoreline, unable to stand still inside his own skin. There are some spirits born from cleansing who immediately go searching for new dirt to scrub from the world, and his was one of those. He stared at the far horizon and saw shapes that needed wrestling, serpents, storms, cities not yet built. His restless temper hammered the first distant thunder into a rhythm that, ages later, war bands would hear in their blood. He was not evil. He was a wind waiting for a harness, a wave waiting to learn what it means to meet a coastline. The harness and the coastline would come. Behind them, Izanagi, who had once stirred the first island from chaos with a jeweled spear and sealed the passage to Yomi with a single, immovable stone, turned away from the water at Takebana. The trio of young powers stood at his back like newly lit lanterns. He did not return to the pillar at Onagoro. That chapter had been closed with his palms against the rock at Yomi's mouth. In the age of myth, turning a page is not a quiet act. Rivers and mountains must agree to it. They did. The first gods nodded like old trees shifting in a light wind. The staff that had traveled through caverns and grief lined once more like an ordinary stick. From that day on, the sky's shapes meant more than weather. The sun moved as a person, not just a lamp. The moon counted as a mind, not merely a coin of reflected light. The sea learned its own griefs and gifts from a god who inhaled and exhaled in time with its swell. The daily rites of washing and setting things right were fixed into memory, not only for gods, but for every household that would one day stand in the shadow of these stories. In each basin of water, in each quiet purification, the river at Takebana was echoed, and the world made itself ready again and again to receive blessing. The arithmetic spoken at the boundary stone did not remain a story. It became reality. Every day, 1,000 doors opened in the houses of endings. Every day, 1,500 opened in the houses of beginnings. The bereaved were never comforted by numbers, but the fields were. Crops trust surplus more than sorrow. In time, priests stood at river bends chanting the names of those first newborn spirits who had risen from the river of purification. Their brooms swept shrine thresholds in slow arcs, whispering old songs embedded in their reeds. Women tied cords to branches, offering the river the burdens their homes could no longer carry. Men pressed their foreheads to stones carved in the shape of judgment. Children were taught to bow before mirrors and the reflections that carried their future selves. All these customs were the long echoes of one man's impossible grief. He had gone to retrieve his wife from the land that keeps what it swallows. He had failed. He had sealed the door with a stone. He had washed. And from that washing rose three presences who would shape the next age. The spear had shaped the land. The stone had fixed the border. The river had brought forth new gods. Now the world shifted toward the quarrels of light, the negotiations of night, and the dangerous kindness of storms. At the beginning of their rule, the three divine children did not yet understand how sharp love within a family can become. Their assignments were clear enough, written like a clean map. Amaterasu would rule the high plain and carry daylight upon her brow. Tsukuyomi would measure the silver hours of night. Susanoo would pace the edges of sea and weather, carrying tempests in his shadow. But maps do not erase the wildness of the heart. The sun carried serenity, sure of her place. The moon carried patience, counting the uncountable. The storm carried an ache. Susanoo bore a wound shaped like his mother's absence. It tugged at him the way the moon tugs at tides, pulling him toward unrest. It was Tsukuyomi who faltered first. Amaterasu sent him to represent her at a banquet held by the food goddess Yuk, she who could turn hunger into blessing. Yuk wished to honor heaven and earth with dishes that sang of every region. She looked to the sea and breathed fish already salted with the language of waves. She faced the mountains and released game perfumed with herbs. She touched the rice fields and filled bowls with steaming grain fragrant with its own harvest. It was miracle, raw miracle. Tsukuyomi watched and felt disgust instead of awe. He saw only the strangeness, the origin, the ritual. He found it defiling, and in the proud sickness of his revulsion, he struck her down. One of the worst dinners in myth ended with a corpse on the floor. When word reached Amaterasu, her grief tilted into judgment. She marked Tsukuyomi with shame and forbade him ever to stand before her again. And so the sun and moon parted ways, not as lovers, but as estranged kin whose messages pass between them only through the seasons. In some tellings, Yuke did not stay dead. Where her body touched the earth, blessings rose, millet, silkworms, rice, horses, oxen. If so, it is another example of sorrow ripening into harvest, as the old stories do again and again. Yet Tsukuyomi's stain remained. He withdrew into the quiet of his night realm, becoming a lord of distance and measured cold. While he counted moonlit hours, Susanoo raged. He mourned a mother he could not save. He churned seas. He tore trees from their roots. Even the bold gods of the high plain felt their sleeves grow heavy with stones as they watched the sky in fear of him. At last, Izanagi's voice rose, the same voice that once stirred up creation and sealed off death. He commanded Susanoo to leave heaven and take his proper place in the lands below. Before obeying, Susanoo swore he would say farewell to his sister and prove himself not poisoned by grief. But Amaterasu knew the cost of error. And she knew her brother. When she heard he was climbing toward the high plain, she braced herself. She braided authority into her hair. She dressed herself in jewels of office and arranged her court with the pure geometry of caution. Susanoo arrived declaring he meant no harm, no overthrow, no storm within her halls. Amaterasu's eyes did not soften. He demanded a trial, a proof of purity. "Let us draw children from each other's sacred regalia," he said. "Let those children decide whether I come in loyalty or in deceit." It was a strange contest born from the logic of gods. Amaterasu took his great sword, broke it into pieces with ritual precision, and washed the shards with sacred words. From the breath rising off that water stepped three goddesses, radiant, composed, with the quiet dignity of dawn dividing itself from night. Susanoo took the string of Magatama jewels from Amaterasu's chest and crushed them between his teeth. From the mist he spat out emerged 5 male gods, broad-browed, fierce, carrying the restless brilliance of firstborn sons. Then came the argument. Susanoo claimed the 5 boys as his own strength made manifest. Amaterasu countered that they came from her jewels and were therefore hers. The 3 maidens born of his sword should be his. Susanoo shouted victory again, drunk on the notion that the 3 maidens were worth more than kingdoms. But victory is a fire, and his heart was full of dry timber. He ran wild through Amaterasu's fields, breaking the banks that held back water. He tore at the furrows like a child who has forgotten the seriousness of play. He barged into the halls where sacred cloth was stretched and beaten to sheen and fouled them with reckless delight. Then came the unforgivable act. Susanoo killed a heavenly pony, flayed it, and hurled the carcass through the roof of the weaving hall where the maidens of the sun goddess worked. The sacred craft was broken. Blood fell on silk. As a young woman died with her shuttle still in her hand, even those who loved storms turned their faces away. There is a moment when a queen decides the world has struck her for the last time. Amaterasu left the court. She did not run. As she withdrew, she stepped into a mountain gorge where a cave opened like a dark mouth. She entered it, pulled a massive stone across the entrance and sat inside. She did not sulk. She simply removed herself from a creation that no longer deserved its light. As among gods, a sun's withdrawal is not symbolic. Day ended, fields wilted, wolves grew brave, creatures that hide by instinct began to prowl openly, staring at the doors of human houses. The heavens lost their lamp, and despair settled like a second night, thicker and more final than the first. Gods began to gather the way storms gather, first in twos and threes, then in a thickening crowd that made the air feel expectant. They came from far ridges and quiet coasts, from forges that never cooled and shrines where dust almost never settled. Divinities who normally kept to their own domains now lined the riverbanks below the dark mouth of the cave where the sun had hidden herself. The smith gods arrived with hands scarred by heat and hammers that still hummed. Jewel spirits came whose fingers tingled when they touched stone. Singers who remembered the first notes of the world before it had a shape. Dancers whose bare feet could read the memory in the ground. Disaster has its own gravity. It pulls wit together. They stood in that pale, lightless valley, talked until their breath stirred a small, shared wind and reached a strange conclusion. If anger had failed, perhaps laughter might succeed. Their plan needed three things: a mirror, a string of jewels, and a performance wild enough to tempt a sun. First, the master smiths were summoned. Under the guidance of Ishikoridome, the shaper of stone, they forged a mirror wide as a drum and smooth enough to hold a sky without a single ripple. Its surface did not just reflect. It waited, empty and bright, for something to remember. Next, they called Tamanuya, old jewel maker of curved stones and patient hands. From his chests he took beads as green as wet pine, as red as silk on fire. He strung them into a long, glimmering rope, a river of color that could catch the eye of any watching god, but especially one who had never been immune to beauty's kindness. Last, they gathered proud cocks, crest high, and set them along the cave's mouth with instructions to crow and keep crowing. Their voices would braid morning into sound, a reminder that while the world laughed, it was laughing in the shadow of something lost. Then they cleared a patch of ground. Someone flipped a tub and turned it into a stage. Onto that makeshift platform climbed Aim no Uzum, goddess of dawn, of dance, of jokes told without shame. She was small, compact as a clenched fist and strong. Her voice could ring off mountainsides. She stamped on the tub until the wood barked and rattled. She shouted and teased with the boldness of a festival. Her sleeves slipped back, her clothes loosened by hints rather than by accident. Her hips turned in old, deep circles, the language the body remembers from the place before birth. Around her, the gods howled with laughter and clapped until their hands tingled. Their cheering rose like the sound of baskets filling with grain, like autumn arriving all at once. The valley, which had swallowed only fear and worry for days, began to echo with something bright enough that even grief itself sat up and listened. Inside the cave, the sun goddess felt joy vibrating through stone. Amaterasu frowned in the dark. She had left a world that had forgotten how to be serious, that had let sacred crafts be insulted and blood spill in holy places. And now, just outside the door of night, they were celebrating. She called out, voice muffled by rock, and demanded to know what could possibly be so delightful when fields withered and palaces sat in shadow. Outside, Aim no Uzum replied that they had found a goddess more splendid than the sun. A new light, fresher and more dazzling, had taken her place. They praised this nameless radiance so loudly that the words themselves glowed. Pride and curiosity touched something in Amaterasu that sorrow had not been able to seal forever shut. She pushed the stone aside just enough to peer through the crack. What she saw was a tree dressed like an altar, branches wrapped in white cloth and fresh green leaves. Along its limbs hung the long strand of jewels, a waterfall of color. And near it, angled just so, stood the great mirror. The laughter washed over her. The praise for this new goddess stung and pulled. Amaterasu leaned forward. In the mirror, someone leaned toward her. She saw a face framed in light, eyes bright, a hair shining, a radiance she did not recognize as her own. Gods, it turns out, are just as fragile as humans when confronted with their reflection. She stepped closer. The face in the mirror grew larger, brighter, nearer. Her heart moved toward it to argue or to greet, no one can say. That was the moment they'd been waiting for. Aim no Tajikarawo, strongest of the waiting gods, leaped forward. He seized her wrist with a grip both firm and careful and pulled her fully out of the cave. Behind her, others slammed the stone door shut and dragged across it a thick rope, twisted and knotted in sacred patterns so powerful that even a goddess would hesitate to step over it. Light returned so fast it seemed poured. It rolled down the valley like milk from an overturned bowl, filling every hollow. The cocks threw their heads back and crowed with a joy that finally matched the world again. Relief spread through creation in ripples. Rice lifted its narrow blades and drank. Carp rolled on their sides and flashed gold in the water. Stones warmed and in their slow mineral way seemed to smile. Centuries later, priests would still reenact Uzum's wild dance, sometimes in solemn theaters, sometimes in dusty village squares. They would stomp and shake and laugh in honor of the day wit and performance saved the world. It is good and right to remember that not all crises are solved with spears. As for Susanoo, heaven did not forget. His punishments were not subtle. His hair was cut, the wild mane that echoed storm clouds shorn away. His nails were torn out, those hooks that clawed at fields and halls. Then the judgment he had postponed for so long finally fell. He was cast from the high plane of heaven, sent down to the country of Izumo. He dropped like a storm that has spent its rage over mountains and now seeks softer land, new roofs to test, new trees to bend. It is worth lingering for a moment at that cave mouth and studying the objects they used to coax the sun out. The mirror would become one of the three sacred treasures by which a sovereign is recognized. It whispers that good rule is not blind. A ruler must look, must see their own face and flinch or soften accordingly. The string of jewels carries the memory of the first economy of worship, the trade between beauty and attention. Devotion, the old stories say, follows charm more easily than command. The rope stretched across the cave's mouth remains the ancestor of every Shimenawa at every shrine. Straw or fiber twisted, knotted, hung to say, here be careful. Cross only with the right heart. And the dance of Uzum endures wherever ritual remembers that the sacred is not only stern. Joy is as binding a rite as mourning. The quarrel between the divine siblings did not vanish with the cave's opening. It continued in new forms, leaving new scars and new reconciliations. But this one episode set the rhythm mortals came to rely on. Light, the story says, can be lost and found again. It can hide. It can be coaxed out with laughter and tact. The sun can be lured by a mirror and tempted by jewels. She can be invited with songs rowdy enough to make even sober gods sway their shoulders. In the oldest ember of this myth, a community solved a crisis not by shouting at divinity, but by putting on a show. That choice tells you a great deal about the world those gods were building. Far above the newly bright valley, Tsukuyomi walked his measured path. He kept his distance. He had not been invited to the dance and would not have come even if called. Instead, he turned his face and hid it, then turned again, over and over, teaching human bodies when to work and when to rest, when to cast nets into the dark water and when to fold them up and sleep. He held his old insult like a stone in cold hands, and slowly let the cold itself wear it smooth. Under his quiet arithmetic, the world learned to breathe at a kinder pace. Amaterasu went back to the high plain, but she did not go back unchanged. She carried with her a companion no one could see. The knowledge that even the brightest presence must sometimes be asked, welcomed, invited. The mirror in her palace watched her as she moved through the day. On quiet afternoons when the court's bustle dimmed, it would catch her face, the same face that had once stared out of a cave mouth, surprised and a little hurt. Now it was edged with something else. Not sadness, not quite wisdom, a new kind of caution, perhaps, a new kind of care. The palace life resumed. Weavers returned to their halls. Their shuttles passed back and forth, and the sound of their work fell like soft rain in spring. Offerings were laid for the food goddess in the forms she had become, for even from her violent death, the gifts of fields and silk and grain had continued to arrive. Tsukuyomi's crime had not been enough to convince the earth to stop being generous. Meanwhile, Susanoo fell. He dropped toward Izumo with no idea that a coiled dragon and a trembling girl would soon change him. His exile was not a simple punishment. It was the turning of another page. The seas called to him with voices he had always heard whispering along his bones. They promised him contests, limits, boundaries he could slam himself against without breaking the world. He carried with him an energy that is not evil but dangerous without shape, a tide that demands a shore. He would find that shore in a valley crossed by a river sharp as a wet sword, and in a house where an old couple held their last daughter like a candle guttering in a storm. But that belongs to the next telling. For now, remember the cave and the noise, the way a goddess forgot her own face for a heartbeat and reached toward it. Remember the smith who made a sun out of stone, the jeweler who turned a river of color into a rope, and the laughing dancer who stomped and shouted until light slid back into the sky. Remember, too, the small warning wrapped in the scandal. A court that makes no room for play will eventually exhaust its own sun. Dignity without joy becomes too heavy to carry. These are not lessons carved in stone. They are bearings, directions by which a people quietly steer their lives. Exile did not quiet the storm within him, it merely gave it direction. When the cord of the high plain cut Susanoo's nails, tore the fury from his hair, and cast him down from heaven's polished halls, the sea claimed him like an old, impatient friend. He fell fast like a wounded wind, like a squall remembering its own name, trailing salt, thunder, and the frayed edges of a temper that the gods themselves could no longer house. He struck the coastline of Izumo with the force of weather, and the stones answered with their booming welcome. This land of reeds and river mouths, of mists that wander without apology, suited him far more than the careful etiquette of heaven ever had. He moved inland along a restless river, its edges white, its heart the color of churned earth until sorrow found him. Not the divine sort, quiet and ceremonial, but human sorrow, the kind that trembles. As it was leaking from the windows of a small house pressed against a worn riverbank. Inside sat an old man and an old woman, both trying and failing to keep their hands steady. Between them was a girl who did not cry. Her stillness said everything. It was the stillness of a child who has watched loss carve her family into smaller and smaller numbers. When Susanoo stepped inside, the old man lifted his eyes and saw a stranger wearing storms in his gaze. He bowed to the floor as though the weight of grief had finally found a reason to bend. He told his story in a voice like rotting wood, soft, collapsing. His name was Ashinazuchi. His wife was Tenazuchi. Their last daughter was Kushinadaheim. They once had 8 daughters. But each year from the mountains a creature descended, a creature with a hunger that counted in daughters. 7 had been taken, and now only 1 remained. There was no cliff high enough, no forest deep enough, no shrine strong enough to hide her heartbeat. So they waited for a night without mercy. Susanoo listened, and for the first time since he'd left heaven, his rage stilled. As the god asked their lineage, they spoke of ancient ties of a family once blessed, then cursed. He asked the name of the valley. They told him it was a land older than maps remembered. He asked the name of the monster, Yamata-no-Orochi. As a name like a blade dragged across stone. And then the storm god made the kind of promise that changes the direction of history. If they would give him Kushinada as a bride, he would sever the calamity that hunted them. The parents agreed. Gratitude and desperation often speak the same language. Susanoo touched the girl's hair, light as petals, and changed her into a fine comb. He placed it behind his ear, close to his storm-shaken heart, so she would remain beside him even as he prepared to face the thing that had stolen 7 lives. Then he stepped outside and felt it. The monster was already turning toward the valley. Old storytellers say Orochi had 8 heads, each dragging the weight of its own hunger. Its tails numbered the same. Its body sprawled over hills and valleys like a mountain range trying to wriggle free of its own shape. Trees grew along its spine, as if it had once mistaken itself for a forest. Its eyes glowed the red of wine left too close to flame, and from its belly oozed sores that leaked poison and old metal. This was not a dragon. This was a memory of chaos wearing scales. Susanoo did not charge it, not this time. He had learned what rashness had cost him in heaven. Instead, he asked for 8 enormous tubs. 8, 1 for each head. He asked the old man to brew a rice wine so strong its scent alone could make the tongue tremble. And together they built a fence, 8 gates, each hiding a vat filled to its brim with the burning drink. When everything was ready, the storm god stepped back and placed his hand on the hilt of a sword that had not yet learned the song it was born for. Even monsters have habits. When night dragged its cold fingertips across the riverbank, Orochi descended. Slowly, deliberately. Each head sniffed the air, caught the scent of the wine, and in a drunken sort of eagerness pressed through a gate. The fence held, the vats waited, the creature drank and drank and drank, until 8 monstrous heads drooped heavy with intoxication, until the bright red eyes blinked slowly then closed, until the river itself seemed to hold its breath. As a mountain fell asleep, Susanoo moved. He stepped through the fence as calmly as a man checking the locks of a quiet shrine. No roar, no theatrics, only a blade and purpose. 1 strike, a second, a third. His 8 heads rolled across the earth like heavy stones caught in a sudden downpour. He waded through blood that shimmered dark in the moonlight. His strikes were clean, practiced, almost meditative. But for the first time in his life, the storm inside him was not destruction, it was precision. Then his blade caught something hard, metal. Inside the creature's final tail lay a sword with a quiet, terrifying beauty. A blade made not by mortals, not by gods, but by the sky's own muttering storms. Aim no Murakumo no Tsurugi, the heavenly sword of gathering clouds. Later it would be called Kusanagi, the grass cutter. But that story belonged to another horizon. Susanoo washed the blade, lifted it, and felt the world shift. Sometimes a monster dies not just to end a hunger, but to release a gift. He sent the sword upward to his sister, Amaterasu, as a gesture of apology, a reminder that even a storm can learn restraint. And in time, that sword, along with a mirror and a jewel, would become the three sacred treasures by which sovereigns are known. But for now, it was simply a bow offered from a brother who had finally learned the cost of his own shadow. When he returned to the small house by the river, he took the comb from his hair, and Kushinada stood beside him again, human, trembling, alive. He married her there, in a room that still held the echoes of old grief. Their home rose in Suga, where the air is clear and the cedar roots drink the cleanest waters. And there, the god of storms, who had once destroyed halls and terrified heaven, spoke the first poem in the language. A verse about a house built around a beloved. A verse as soft as settling dust. A verse that sounded like a long-delayed breath finally released. Poetry and the sword have always shared the same table in the myths of this land, one softening the world, the other reshaping it. Susanoo was no exception. He did not mellow into gentleness, not fully. He remained a storm wrapped in flesh, a shifting brilliance like sunlight flickering on a restless wave. But Izumo learned something important. A storm can be useful if it chooses where to break. And slowly, almost grudgingly, Susanoo learned it too. He taught the river villages how to carve channels that led floodwater safely back to the sea. He reminded fishermen to lash their roof beams tight, to listen to the groan of wood the way a sailor listens to rope. He stood between the rage of the ocean and the trembling walls of homes, calling each danger by its proper name. The god who once tore dikes apart in victory now told young boys to test a wall's strength with their heel and their ear, to hear if its heart was hollow, to feel if its spine would break. Marriage softened his edges, though nothing could ever blunt them. Kushinada's quiet rituals, her offerings before dawn, her gentle tending of thresholds and shadows, these things curled around the storm god's temper like vines around stone. At times, he would go alone to the shore. He would stand with his feet buried in wet sand, his gaze lost somewhere in the dark thrum of waves. And then, without explanation, he would return home carrying fish whose scales shimmered like coins spilled from the sleeve of the sun. The old couple who had once trembled in terror lived to see peace growing like moss across their remaining years. They held grandchildren on their knees. They slept without dreaming of mountains splitting open. The pass above their home no longer breathed hunger. Yet the story pauses here for a reason. Because the craft that saved the girl, the fence of 8 gates, the cunning trap of 8 vats, carries more meaning than its wooden stakes and boiling wine. The tales insist on the number 8 as if repetition itself were a spell. 8 heads, 8 tails, 8 gates, 8 vats, layers upon layers like walls of prayer. A single defense can fail. But 8 share the burden of fear. A monster can resist 1 cup of sake. 8 vats drown its hunger in sweetness. Susanoo did not defeat chaos by outrunning it. He fed its appetite until it dropped its guard, and then he ended it. Strength mattered. But preparation mattered more. And hidden within the belly of the monster, as happens in myths that understand the nature of chaos, he found a gift forged in the dark. A sword waiting to be taken. A reminder that even in the gut of destruction, something belonging to order can be found. but only by the one brave enough to reach for it. And when Susanoo lifted that blade, he did not boast or brandish it. He sent it upward to the sister he had wronged. A storm admitting fault is a rare thing. A storm offering a gift is rarer still. That sword would one day rest in a mortal's hands. But first it belonged to the sun. Suga, the home Susanoo built, became more than a house. It became a school shaped from weather and wisdom. Elders who had seen rivers boiled by dragon blood warned boys that rage could build nothing, only break. Gakushinada taught girls that calmness could be a shield sharper than any blade. Susanoo slept without the knot of anger on his brow. He woke without thunder clenched in his fists. He did not cease being a storm. He became one that understood the difference between a fortress and a field. But Izumo's history does not end in this warmth, for storms leave legacies. And from Susanoo's line rose another, a god made not from thunder but from patience. A builder, not a breaker, a healer, not a hurler of spears, Ukyunanushi, the master of the great land. He did not begin like gods are expected to begin, no blazing entrances, no thrones greeting him at birth. He was the youngest among 80 brothers, a number so large that the storytellers abandoned counting and simply called them many. These brothers hunted with pride, spoke loudly, and courted women with the confidence of men who believe the world was designed to applaud them. Their target was a princess of Inaba Yagami Heim, a woman whose judgment cut cleaner than the blades men swung to impress her. Eyes like river water, mind sharp as winter glass. The brothers marched to woo her, their swagger echoing down the road. Behind them walked Ukyunanushi, stooped under the weight of their bundles, his shoulders marked by the straps. There is a particular kind of greatness that grows only in the last position, where one sees what pride blocks from view. Along the way, they found a white hare curled in pain, its skin stripped by seafolk mischief. The creature lay trembling in a patch of sand that stung with every breath. The elder brothers laughed, mocked it, offered cruel advice disguised as help, telling it to bathe in salt, telling it to stand in the wind. The hare obeyed and agony swallowed it whole. Then Ukyunanushi arrived. He lowered the burdens from his shoulders, he knelt, and he spoke with the softness reserved for children, the wounded, and those who have been failed too many times. Wash in fresh water, then lie in soft reeds, let the pollen heal you. The hare did so, and its pain fled like a shadow at noon. Restored, it lifted its head and blessed him. It foretold that the princess would not choose cruelty. She would choose the man who helped a creature too small to defend itself. And the prophecy held true. Yagami Heim saw through the boasts and ornaments of the 80. She saw the youngest, quiet and burdened, and named him her husband. His insult lit the faces of the brothers. And insult, when mixed with pride, becomes poison. They sought to kill him, and they set a trap designed not for a brother but for a monster. They coaxed him into a burning pit, left him to die as charred bones in a fire built of envy. But in the old telling, a mother's voice still had the strength to call him back. In some tellings, it was his mother who pulled him back from the edge of death. In others, it was the quiet arrival of healing gods, stepping out of groves where the bark holds old prayers, out of mountains where the moss remembers old names. They bent over his burned, broken body with hands that smelled of herbs and river stone. Either way, the pattern remained. The boy who had once lifted a hare out of pain was lifted in turn by those who chose to care for him. He woke with scars that did not fade. They stitched themselves into his story, lines that would one day be read like sacred text. His brothers were not finished. but the world was tired of them. Their malice had the stale taste of a trick told too many times. And the mother who had saved the youngest son understood that the only mercy left was distance. She told him of a place under the skin of the earth, a root world where thunder had a house and Susanoo held court. If you want to live, she said, go down, find the storm father, let him test you, survive his trials, win his favor, earn a power that envy cannot bend back against you. Obedience to such counsel is not weakness. It is a quieter courage that songs often forget to praise. So he went. The path to Susanoo's realm led through valleys where the wind tasted like iron and old rain. Light there did not fall from the sky. It seeped from stone and flowed along ceilings like a pale river. At the end of that descent stood a fortress carved from fear and hospitality in equal measure. In it lived a daughter of the storm god, Suzuriheim. When Ukyunanushi stepped into that hall, still carrying the smoke of betrayal in his clothes, she saw something he had not yet seen in himself, a steady flame. Not a bonfire, not a lightning strike. It was the kind of flame that cooks food without burning it, the kind that stays. Love did not need words. It found its shape in the way they looked at each other and did not glance away. Then Susanoo arrived, laughter booming like surf under a cliff, his presence filling the room with old weather. He considered the visitor who dared to love his daughter. The storm does not give anything lightly. If you wish to be kin, he said, live one night in the hall where my serpents sleep. The snakes, he added, were not kind. That night Ukyunanushi walked into a darkness rustling with scales. Suzuriheim followed in secret and pressed a scarf into his hands, a charm wrapped in cloth. When the serpents rose, eyes bright, tongues tasting his fear, he wrapped himself in the gift. Their venom-thick fangs found only protection. Their bites could not remember him. Surviving once was not enough. More trials followed, each crafted like a lesson. A chamber where centipedes marched in iron bands, armor clacking like teeth. A room of bees thick in the air, each one a needle with wings, all of them able to smell fear as plainly as smoke. A storehouse full of things that woke if you stared too long, eyes hidden in ordinary shapes. In each test, Suzuriheim gave him what the storm withheld, knowledge, a string that could bind danger instead of inviting it, a tune that led anger harmlessly in circles, a small delay that opened into a wide escape. She taught him that a single grain of patience weighs more than a mountain of force. Finally, Susanoo prepared the sharpest edge of his teaching. He ordered Ukyunanushi to twist his hair into a knot and fix it in place with a bow. He then led him to a bare field, left him standing in its center, and set the grass on fire. Flames rose up in a ring. The ring began to tighten. Heat pressed against him from every side. Smoke climbed into the sky like a dark prayer. Ukyunanushi did not panic. He did not plead with the gods above or beat his fists against the wall of fire. He remembered an older story of a sword found in a serpent's tail, of steel that could cut more than flesh. As he drew his blade and cut the grass where it burned weakest, he carved open the circle. He walked out alive. A trap cannot hold a mind that knows how to look for its seam. Susanoo watched, and somewhere under the armor of his temper, respect settled in. Even then, he had one more gesture to make half threat, half blessing. Above the marriage bed, he hung the great sword, the one that had once driven itself through a dragon's body and found a hidden blade in its tail. Steel glinted above the pillows, whispering that a god never truly retires his edge, even inside his own home. It was, in its rough way, permission. He gave his daughter to Ukyunanushi with a look that said, Protect what I love, and I may remember on good days to approve of you. From his power, he gave not only weapons, but words, phrases that could bind, phrases that could loose, the beginnings of incantations that would one day sit in the mouths of priests. As the young couple left the house beneath the thunder and rose back into daylight, carrying with them weapons that could not be seen, patience, shared counsel, and the habit of laughing before anger found a place to sit. Back in the river world, Nushi began what the old tongue calls the making of the land. Not walls, not palaces, something harder. He became the one spirits approached when they quarreled. The one mortals approached when their shrines failed or their fields soured. He learned the moods of marshes, the particular stubbornness of certain winds. He learned what herbs wanted in exchange for their healing. Night fevers, they taught, could be persuaded to leave if the patient drank clear water blessed over the seventh leaf of a stalk that grows where cranes sleep. The bites of unseen things could be soothed if smoke was drawn 3 times through a ring of reed, 3 times through a ring of willow, and then breathed in with a promise to live differently. Such instructions make scholars grimace and elder storytellers smile. But it is by such threads that a people stitch themselves together. In time, an unexpected companion joined him. He was barely the height of a man's knee and narrow-shouldered above it, a quick-eyed, quick-handed. He arrived riding a stalk as if it were a boat. His name was Tsukuyomi, Little Lord, and his entrance was as strange as his stature. Some said he'd fallen from the sleeve of an annoyed god. Others said he'd been tossed away as a useless seed by a giant who didn't know what he held. However he came, he greeted Nushi with the boldness of someone who assumes he will be forgiven. Together, the tall god and the small one changed the texture of the land. They taught how to brew medicines that eased aching bones and helped women survive the tearing fire of childbirth. They taught farmers the manners that fields expect, the way to step, the way to thank. They drove hungry spirits out of granaries with rituals that looked like jokes from far away and like serious negotiations up close. They raised boundary stones that spirits could read as easily as humans read doorframes. They taught songs for asking a hill to share room for a road. For a while, they were a walking comedy. A great land god and his knee-high partner, clambering over ridges and riverbanks, healing, bargaining, straightening what had grown crooked. Then the day came when the little one said goodbye. Tsukuyomi leaped, impossibly far into the distance, across a stretch of sea that does not forgive return. Nushi watched the path of his departure glow and fade, and then turned back to his work with the quiet that always follows the end of a good chapter. By then, the 80 brothers were mostly gone, swallowed by their own schemes or simply worn away into stories no one bothered to repeat. The master of the great land stood in golden fields and saw that the hill gods no longer stormed down at night to trample the rose. The children played at being him, copying his walk, his way of standing at boundaries and listening. That is how a people decide what a hero looks like. Shrines rose under his eye, facing east and west in ways that kept the weather mild. Markets grew out of festival gatherings, little pockets where gossip learned to walk on feet and trade turned into the nervous system of the land. It wasn't a golden age. There are none. But it was a sturdy time, the kind in which gold learns to mix with patience. Order in one realm hums like a song in the next. High above, in the bright court of the high plain, the sun had returned fully to her duties. The halls were repaired. The memories of darkness had become warnings rather than wounds. Amaterasu and her council looked down and saw a land that no longer needed rescuing every season. It was ready for something else. They had long held a promise that the line of the high plain would one day take stewardship of the reed plain below. The pact between heaven and earth had to be made, spoken, and signed in the old ways, so they chose a familiar pattern. First, ask for a gift. Then, ensure refusal would be unwise. Messengers came and went, words were weighed, omens were taken. At last, one envoy descended who moved like a sword drawn in a single smooth stroke, a sword flash in human form, the tales call him. As he followed the gullies of mountains and the noses of gods until he stood before Ukyunanushi, he carried welcome, he carried threat, he carried an invitation. The master of the great land did not grab for his weapon. Instead, he called his sons. First came Kodo Shiro, god of harbors and of luck, who understands that a ship does not simply have fortune, it agrees to it. He listened. He did not need long, he did not resist, he agreed. The first son stepped away with quiet dignity, choosing solitude over struggle. The sea received his small boat with the gentleness shown to an old friend, the kind of friend who knows the tide's tempers and does not disturb them. His withdrawal was not defeat, it was understanding, but not all sons choose the soft exit. The second son arrived like a blade carried down from the mountains. Taketsu, all shoulder and sinew, a god carved from straightforward strength, looked upon the envoy who had descended from the high plain. The messenger's presence was a storm inside a single body, a reminder that law can wear flesh when it chooses to. Taketsu did not bow. Strength rarely bows first. He declared plainly, proudly, that he would not yield one finger's width of earth to heaven. Words struck stone, sparks flew. And when speeches reached their limit, hands replaced them as they always have. They seized each other by the wrist. Taketsu felt the envoy's skin shift, first into the cold bite of ice, then into the bright burn of flame, transformations that spoke of a lineage higher than clouds. The mountain-born god braced, pushed, stamped, but every exertion met something stronger, not crueler, simply greater. Then he found himself pinned, not hurt, just held still by a pressure that refused debate. When he rose, his pride stung more than his body. He did not slink away, yet neither did he sing. He walked northward toward Shinano, a land of young rivers and quiet vows. There he pledged to leave trouble to those who liked the taste of it. Kyunoni watched these choices, one son turning to sea, another to mountains, and weighed heavens offer against the steady breathing of the nation he had shaped with patience. As he knew land is not merely held, it is understood, so he asked for a different crown. If the high plain takes the open earth, he said, let me keep what lies beneath and behind the hidden chambers of the world, the quiet realm where thoughts gather before becoming deeds. Build me a shrine worthy of such an office. Raise pillars tall enough for cranes to mistake for cliffs. Make a roof so wide that rain softens its voice upon it. Let the people remember that what they cannot see is as alive as what they can. It was a magnificent request disguised as modest duty. And heaven agreed. The envoy nodded. The ground answered with a tremor not of fear but of assent. From forests and valleys, craftsmen came humming prayers. They asked the cedars to give themselves willingly. They carved beams that still remembered mountains even as they learned the discipline of roofs. They shaped stairways soft enough for divine feet, spread gravel bright as fallen starlight, and laid the bones of a building meant to shelter gods and guide mortals. The shrine of Izumo rose like a great wing unfurled. During festivals, the air itself seems to expand, making space for more presences than eyes can count. Cunini took his place there, builder of nations, keeper of marriages, master of the furtive realm where the invisible becomes real. And then, in a gesture older than any chronicle, he stepped sideways from the visible world. He did not die. He shifted. He moved into the polite shadows, taking charge of the unseen territory where every whispered prayer and every half-formed hope has a place to land. They call him the Great Spirit of the Unseen Land. If your whispered wish at a lonely crossroads feels heard, it is said to be his attention brushing your elbow. Thus the land passed from a patient maker to the lineage of those who would walk down from clouds. It was not a handover of objects. It was a ceremony of grown souls acknowledging each other. Earth kept its household gods. Heaven sealed its promise. The story that began with a spear stirring the sea now bent toward a new descent, one not from water but from sky. A grandson would come carrying three gifts: a mirror, a jewel, a sword. Then a hunter would learn love from a blossom and refuse the endurance of stone, teaching humankind that beauty is often brief. After him, another would lose a hook and in losing find a dragon palace and a wife and a lineage. Eventually, that lineage would build capitals, calendars, and crowns. But that waits on another horizon. For now, imagine Izumo's great roof glistening after rain. A sacred rope as thick as a river hangs over the entrance. Pillars stand inside like quiet, listening trees. Air moves slowly, respectfully. The master of the great land is there, not seen, not absent, the way a hearth is always in a house, even when the fire sleeps. In the fields outside, ditches follow the teachings he left behind. In the marketplace, a woman sells a cough remedy invented long ago by a tall god and a small friend comparing leaves in the shade. The hills give foxfire. The courts give law. And the people walk between them with gestures of respect so small they cost nothing and yet save the world. There is a way a story inclines when heaven steps down. It does not fall. It does not drift. It lowers itself with ceremony, like a lantern eased into a hall swept of every grain of dust. From her bright throne, Amaterasu looked down and saw a land ready for a bridge of flesh, someone who could carry daylight in his bones. Her first choice was her son, the master of broad skies, but he hesitated. The founding is hard bread and long patience. Messengers tried the descent, but one drowned himself in comfort, forgetting the sharpness of duty until the truth found him through the shaft of an arrow. The lesson was simple. A wanderer cannot bear a mandate, so the choice fell to her grandson. Nigi, young, divine, and destined, surrounded by advisors, guarded by gods whose wisdom walked ahead of him. His descent would be the hinge between divine ages and human ones. Before he left, his grandmother placed the three sacred treasures in his hands: a mirror where truth rests like still water, a jewel curved like memory and heavy with lineage, and the sword born inside a serpent, a blade forged for chaos then reclaimed for order, not trinkets, not ornaments, pledges. The mirror promised rule that reflects and remembers. The jewel promised a bond that would hold a realm together, beautiful in its glow, unbreakable in its purpose. The sword promised the courage to cut away anything that threatened fields, families, or the fragile order that rests upon both. With these pledges in hand, Ninigi stood ready, the weight of heaven balanced lightly across his shoulders, as though the sky itself trusted him not to drop it. He did not stand alone. Around him gathered a company of deities whose names sounded like the opening lines of a sacred hymn. There was the goddess who had once danced the sun out of hiding, whose laughter could turn necessity into joy and fear into something that knew how to retreat. There were ritual keepers with long memories, spirits who knew which rice to scatter, which syllables to speak, which breaths to hold or release when inviting good fortune to take a seat beside mortals. Behind them stood a power whose hands were large enough to brace a mountain path if the earth grew stubborn. Together, the procession descended from heaven like a constellation rearranging itself into a story. At the place where sky begins to touch the shoulders of the hills, they met the tall, formidable spirit who guards the threshold of the lower world. His presence was the kind that straightens the backs of even the confident. He is the keeper of the great way, the gate where all journeys must confess themselves. He did not move aside. Threshold gods never do, not for titles, not for retinues, not for displays of divine authority. The company did not reach for their swords. Instead, the goddess of dawn stepped forward, just as she had once stepped before the cave where the sun hid. Her presence carried the warmth of first light upon stone. She greeted the guardian not with force but with delight, speaking to his pride with compliments crafted from old truth, teasing a smile out of a face carved by centuries. His stubbornness loosened like a knot undone by laughter. As he guided them down the right mountain spur into the deep green folds of Kyushu, and stood aside as Ninigi placed his foot upon a crest where air tasted of cedar, river waiter, and the beginning of a new chapter in the world's long ledger. There upon the mountain called Takajoho, the prince made his camp. He arranged the treasures of heaven with deliberate care, mirror, jewels, sword, each placed as though he were not merely beginning a rule but tuning the atmosphere itself. Rule in those early lands was not the shouting of commands. It was the slow knitting of balance between fields and floods, between shrines and markets, between the old gods who had shaped valleys and the new names descending from the sky. Ninigi asked nothing of the local spirits except cooperation. He did not drive them out. He asked them to share a calendar, and because he gave respect before seeking authority, they accepted. It was only after harmony settled on the mountain that the god of that place sent visitors. Two daughters came walking along the slope toward Ninigi. The elder was Iwanaga, the lady of the rock, silent, enduring, her presence the quiet comfort of stone warmed after a long day of sunlight. The younger was Kanohana, the lady of blossoms, her steps as light as spring wind, her smile carrying the promise of ripeness and renewal. Their father sent them both not as offerings but as blessings, from one endurance, from the other beauty. Ninigi saw Kanohana first. His heart made its choice without hesitation. He asked for her hand and overlooked the elder sister. The message returned to the mountain lord, and though he was fair, he felt the sting of insult. As he answered with a warning wrapped in courtesy, "You accepted the flower and rejected the rock. Because you turned from endurance, your line will bloom brightly but briefly. If you had embraced both, your descendants would have lasted as mountains last." And so a god wrote mortality into the story of rulers and of ordinary people. The truth is hard, yet it is familiar. We reach for brightness even knowing it fades. We choose beauty even knowing its season is short. Our hearts are shaped as much by impermanence as by life. Ninigi and Kanohana were married with rites fit for a union meant to anchor a realm. But joy had barely settled into the corners of their newly built home before rumor crept in like a draft beneath a poorly sealed door. Kanohana conceived quickly, and in her husband's mind a small doubt rose, a fish breaking the surface of still water. Was the child his, or another man's? Doubt is acid in the hands of a ruler. It eats through reason, through trust, through the memory of one's own better nature. Konohana chose to extinguish the poison with a trial that has been whispered around hearths for centuries. She built a birthing hut of reeds. When the hour came, she entered it and told her husband that if the child within her was not his, the fire would expose her. She set the hut alight. Neighbors gathered at the edges of the flames with stunned faces. The fire climbed the walls, greedy at first, then graceful. Smoke curled upward like thin gray ribbons. Ninigi stood frozen, speechless. When the roof finally collapsed inward, it fell around her, not upon her. Konohana stepped out of the fire bearing a son whose skin glowed with the quiet health of divine blessing. Another son followed. In some provinces, a third. Their names changed from region to region, but their natures were constant. One loved the sea, one loved contest, one loved the mountains and the chase. The youngest, he is the one whose path will carry us into stories of dragon palaces and kings in scaled armor. But before we follow him, the home he left must be understood. Ninigi ruled the southern lands with the calm gifted by the mirror, a steadiness that made farmers trust him and spirits answer him. He learned which prayers belonged before planting and which before harvest. He settled disputes before quarrels could turn into fists. He kept the threshold guardian beside him in memory and the laughter of the dawn dancer close at hand. Without those two forces, boundary and joy, no court survives long. He was not a maker of roads or boundaries like the master of the great land. He was a keeper of order, a steward who ensured that what had been built did not unravel. Konohana walked her gardens and watched the petals fall. She did not resent the fate given to her, for endurance had not been hers to carry. Instead, she taught her sons a gentler truth. Blossoms are precious because they do not stay. A rice field at perfect ripeness holds a note for only a moment. A marriage changes from its first hour to its last, and that is not loss, it is life. But peace between brothers is a fragile thing. The youngest son, lover of mountains, quarreled with his elder brother, lover of tides. Their disagreement began simply. "Let us exchange tools," the hunter said, "so that I may understand your work and you may understand mine." The fisherman agreed. The hunter took the hook and lost it. He searched with fervor, crafting many replacements, offering each to his brother in apology. But the elder refused every gesture. He wanted the original. The story bent in that refusal toward a distant sea palace and a princess whose father wore the tides as a cloak. Ninigi watched his sons, weighed their quarrel with quiet hands, and kept the fragile peace intact, though the hook, and what its loss would awaken, waited in the deep. The next morning, Ninigi looked upon his youngest son, still bent by guilt, still carrying the weight of a small iron hook lost to the sea, and he offered counsel that sounded simple, almost ordinary. But like many soft-spoken truths in myth, it opened the door to another age. "Find where lost things go to rest," he said. "Not everything stays on the sand. Some things lie in the vaults of kings who breathe water instead of air. If you approach the sea with courage and courtesy, it may decide you are worthy of an answer." Those words, spoken with a ruler's calm and a father's patience, sent the young hunter toward his destiny. Meanwhile, the court around Ninigi had begun settling into the shape that later courts would echo for centuries. The choice he once made, blossom over rock, still whispered through the halls like a quiet rule of nature. Blossoms bloom beautifully and briefly. So too would human lives. A truth woven not as punishment but as a gift. Eternal days smother the heart, measured days teach it how to choose. And so rulers learned that a crown is not a promise of immortal years. It is a circle of responsibility meant to be set down cleanly and willingly when its season ends. Ninigi's court flourished in this philosophy. A purification keepers walked soft paths, whispering the names of small gods who brushed stains from doorways. Singers eased crowds after hard verdicts so resentment would not sharpen into knives. Moon watchers counted nights with precise, patient eyes, telling farmers when to plant, when to wait, when to trust the soil again. Smiths shaped tools before weapons, and even their hammers rested when festivals asked for silence. Rule was a dance. Ninigi learned its rhythm and taught it, but the tale was beginning to lean toward the sea. The youngest son, Huri, the hunter, would soon walk a path beneath waves, where lantern fish hung like quiet stars and corridors echoed with the calm heartbeat of the deep. He would meet a princess drawn from water's gentlest movements and its darkest silences. He would break a promise, because all heroes must, and pay the cost of grief that does not belong to him alone. He would return holding a jewel capable of calling tides like obedient horses. And through that jewel, mountains and shores would learn their rightful balance. But before following him downward, the story looks once more at Ninigi on the mountain at Takachiho. He did not conquer the land with blades, he married it. He offered patience to its hills, courtesy to its spirits, and steadiness to its people. Every day he used the mirror and the jewel, the gifts of reflection and connection. The sword remained at rest, sleeping like a promise made only to necessity. Children played in the courtyards, tracing shapes of treasure in the air, pretending to rule with justice so natural it required no reminder. Dawn dancers rehearsed, their feet whispering the old tale of the cave, the mirror, and the laughter that coaxes light from hiding. In the evenings, the prince sat beside Konohana and listened to surf and crickets weave their small music through the warm southern air. He envied nothing. He waited for the next right task. That task belonged to his sons. In the house of Ninigi, rivalry began as it often does, a crease in shared cloth, a difference in gifts. The elder brother was Hodri, master of tides, whose hands knew the sea the way a harpist knows strings. The younger was Huri, the hunter of mountains, patient with antler and leaf, attuned to the silence that teaches more than speech. Their quarrel began not in anger but in curiosity. "Let us trade," Huri said. "Give me your hook, take my bow. I will learn your world and you may learn mine." Hodri agreed, as brothers sometimes do, trusting that nothing important can truly go wrong. But the sea does not always honor naive hope. Huri cast the borrowed hook into the surf with the earnestness of a student seeking wisdom. The line tightened, loosened, tightened again, then suddenly went slack as if a verdict had been delivered. The hook was gone. He searched the sand, the shallows, the hidden crevices where tidewater folds its secrets. Shame rose in him like a second tide. He forged new hooks many and offered them with bowed head and a heart that had not learned how to fail. But Hodri refused each one. Only the original mattered, the iron shaped by the hand that first shaped it, the tool blessed by use and memory. That refusal became the hinge on which the world turned. Ahuri went to his father not with excuses but with honesty. Ninigi did not scold. Blame does not coax lost things from water. "Find where lost things are kept," he said. "There are palaces beneath the sea, houses with kings, courts, treasures, and laws. Do not go as a thief. Go with courtesy. Go with the clarity of a supplicant who knows his request." Hyuri bowed, took the counsel, and walked the shore until he reached a place where land seemed to end not in rock but in thought. There he sat as the tide climbed, speaking to it as though speaking to a noble host. The sea answered. It lifted him the way a litter lifts a guest and carried him down through halls of blue. The palace of the Sea King lay waiting. It was not made of timber or tile. It was shaped by currents that understood patience and by coral that remembered the labor of building. Whale-rib pillars arched overhead. Shell courtyards glimmered like broken moons. Lantern fish hovered in stillness, glowing softly where corridors hungered for light. Fish guards watched the gate with stern, ancient eyes, their mouths set like old generals recalling the battles of tides. The king of this realm was Watatsumi, Ryujin, the dragon of the deep, whose beard shifted like a wave deciding whether to rise or rest. When Hyuri reached the gate, he was recognized, not by his face but by the purity of his approach. He placed his hands forward in humility, bowed his head just enough, and asked to be heard. And the sea at last listened. The gatekeeper of the Sea King's palace had seen many who arrived demanding and very few who arrived asking. That difference is a key that fits many locks. He watched the young man standing before him, hands open, voice steady, pride held in check, and decided this was one of the rare ones. As he led Hyuri inward. In all courts, whether under lamps or under waves, there is an old rule. The prince who knows how to wait will sit nearer the heart of power than the man who shouts his name at the door. Hyuri was brought to a pavilion where the waters quiet had learned to sit in human form. A woman waited there with the still composure of a bowl brimming to its edge but not spilling. She was the daughter of the Sea King, and her name was Toyotama, Abundant Jewels. The name was not a metaphor, it was a description. She was the shimmer you see when the moon lays its pale hand on the surface of the water. When she lifted her eyes, even the current seemed to hesitate. Stories agree on this point. Love came upon them quickly but not clumsily, not like an arrow out of nowhere. More like two shapes realizing they were cut from the same pattern. The world made a small, inaudible sound of approval. The Sea King, Ryujin, watched this unfolding with the patience of an old tide. In a handful of heartbeats, he read lineage in the tilt of Hyuri's head and courtesy in the way he placed his weight upon the floor. These are the things that sit on a brow like seals, visible to those who have ruled long. He welcomed the visitor and asked, "For what business have you come so far?" Hyuri did not hide behind clever words. "I have lost my brother's hook," he said. "Peace in my house requires that I return the very hook that was given into my care. No copy will do." The honesty pleased the Dragon King. Ryujin called for his subjects, and the fish came in a single sweeping motion, a living curtain across the pavilion. He asked each whether a hook had troubled its throat. One red bream twisted, gaping. The servants reached in with practiced hands and drew out the iron, setting it upon a shell that seemed to shine with the clean satisfaction of a task finished exactly as it should be. The hook was found. The quest, in one sense, was complete. But the sea is rarely content with a single answer, and neither are the old stories. Hyuri stayed. Days blurred into a season that the tales are content to call joy. He remained in the palace as an honored guest, and the Sea King became more than a host, he became a father. Toyotama became more than a radiant presence, she became a wife. Their wedding is remembered in images that belong only to the deep. The pearls hung not merely as ornaments, but like fallen stars permitted to shine at a lower height. Crabs walked in solemn lines, tracing auspicious characters into sand that does not forget. Lantern fish arranged themselves in slow constellations. The sea breathed in long, steady cycles. The palace breathed with it. For once, a myth was allowed to be openly, maturely happy. But home is a gravity that never really sleeps. After 3 years, Huri felt the pull of the mountains again. The slopes where his footsteps had learned silence. The house where his father's advice still seemed to hang in the air like incense. He went to Toyotama and spoke not as a prince commanded, but as a man torn. He asked leave to return to the upper world and promised that he would send word, that he would not let absence harden into abandonment. Toyotama listened the way women who have loved princes have learned to listen. She did not put chains around his promise. She simply asked him to remember what he owed the sea. Ryujin stepped forward and placed two objects in Huri's hands. They were small enough to rest against his palms and vast enough to threaten plains. They were called the tide-controlling jewels. One summoned water, the other dismissed it. With one, a field could become a bay. With the other, a bay could become a road. The Sea King did not give such things lightly. He knew the shape of human quarrels and understood that the unresolved tension between Huri and Hodri would be waiting on shore like a cup never emptied. So he gave his new son these jewels, not just as gifts, but as leverage, gentleness backed by the possibility of force. Huri rose from the sea and stepped once more onto a familiar coast. The air felt thinner now, the sky strangely light after the dense blue ceilings of Ryujin's halls. He sought out his elder brother. Hodri had not softened in his absence. If anything, the absence had given his resentment time to polish itself. Huri returned the original hook. He offered neither lecture nor blame. He asked for peace. Peace was refused. The elder brother went on fishing with anger wrapped around his line, throwing out threats the way others cast nets. There is a kind of pride that will choke on water before it will swallow a simple apology. So Huri lifted the first jewel. He held it in his palm and spoke the word his father-in-law had taught him beneath the sea. The ocean answered. Water climbed the shore, then the street, then the house, then the steps. Hodri felt it at his belt, then his chest, then his throat. The world that had always bowed to him suddenly did not care what he was called. At last, he cried out for mercy, and mercy is a heavy word when it must travel over a proud tongue. Then Huri lifted the second jewel. The sea exhaled and retreated, smoothing itself away from the land as though someone had just straightened a rumpled bed. Hodri fell like a fish dropped from a basket back onto dry planks, shaken, gasping, suddenly aware of edges he had never respected. He promised obedience. This time he meant it. Some quarrels do not end in love. They end in a shared understanding that there is a boundary, and that boundary, if kept, is a kind of peace. The sea, having been stage and palace, now returned to its oldest role. Womb. Toyotama came up from the deep to give birth on land, following Huri to the shore. The old tellers grow especially gentle here. She is not simply a princess with a treasure name. She is a woman trying to balance two natures without shattering either. She asked Huri to build a birthing hut on the sand, thatched with beech reeds. She asked him for privacy, not with desperation, but with the quiet firmness of someone who knows what must not be seen. "Do not look upon me during the birth," she said. The taboo was not a decoration. It was the plank the story needed in order to cross from sea to land. Huri promised. For a while the promise held. But curiosity is a narrow door through which many worlds change. Is at some point a cry, a silence, a pang of fear, or a flare of pride, his resolve wavered. He peered inside. He did not see a human woman in labor. He saw the true form of a sea being bringing forth life on land. The old texts call that form Wani, a dragon, a great water creature, a sacred shape made from liquid strength. Whatever name you give it, the sight struck him like lightning. It did not kill him, but it cracked something in him that could not be mended with apologies. He recoiled. He had looked where he was forbidden to look. He had stripped away a veil that allowed two worlds to love each other. Toyotama felt the break as a sudden cold. She did not scream. She did not beg. She wrapped the newborn in soft cloth and kissed him with the aching tenderness of a mother who knows this will be her last touch. Then she left the hut, walked into the tide, and did not turn back. She returned to the palace where lantern fish hang in careful constellations and put her grief away the way some wounds must be put away, not because they are small, but because they are too large to stare at every day. They are stored in a room inside the heart, visited in silence. The child remained on the shore. He was given into the care of Toyotama's younger sister, Tamyori, whose name carries hints of jewel and binding thread. She became his nurse first, then in time his wife, a loop of kinship common in old tales where families fold inward to keep a line alive. The boy received a name that sounded like a long breath and a memory at once. Yugiya Fukyu, a phrase that recalls the cormorant feather thatching of the hut that was never finished. The house of birth left incomplete because a promise was broken and a mother went back to the sea. He grew with the composed calm often seen in children who have always been watched closely. Tamyori taught him how to bow correctly at thresholds, how to listen when old men tell the same story with different endings, how to recognize when silence is wiser than a question. When the years had turned enough that propriety could be woven into a marriage without scandal, he took her as his wife. From their union came sons whose names would not end at the shoreline of myth, but walk into history, toward capitals, calendars, and human sovereigns. That, however, is the next chapter. For now, the broken promise at the shore deserves one more quiet look. It is not a scene meant to humiliate a hero, nor to cast a princess in shadow. It is the engine by which the story explains something important. To cross a border between sea and land, God and human, seen and unseen, is not a casual act. It demands reverence. It demands restraint. And when that restraint fails, something beloved must always go back to where it came from. A sea wife can love a husband of the land, and a land-born man can love a wife of the tides. But the story has always warned that such love must be tended with more care than fire or water. There must be secrecy where secrecy is asked. There must be reverence where reverence is owed. A vow is not a ribbon for amusement. It is a bridge between worlds, and if that bridge is shaken, each world retreats to its own ancient tide. The child who stands at the meeting point must then carry the burden forward by living well enough to mend what was broken. Cruder minds in later years tried to twist this tale into something smaller, but the oldest version is clear. It asks us to respect what intimacy requires. It asks us to accept that not every truth may be safely stared at. And so the story does not end where heartbreak landed. It deepens. Hodri did not vanish after the day the sea rose to his lips and humbled him. He stepped back from the fiercest waters and took a quieter portion of the coast for himself, a dignified retirement carved not from bitterness, but from understanding. He let younger hands shape the fortunes of the family. He yielded, finally, to peace. The tide-controlling jewels did not become weapons for tyranny. Hyuri kept them as reminders that the Sea King had accepted him as kin, and he used them sparingly. Even jewels of great power know when they must remain in their box. Peace between mountain and surf is not something won once. It is a peace rebuilt every day by men who choose restraint over dominance, even when gifted with tools that could conquer. Ahuri himself never reached for a throne. He is remembered as an ancestor, not a lord, and there is a particular sweetness in that. Ancestors endure longer in memory than rulers. He taught his sons where a river bites into its banks and how to soothe it with a neat line of stones. He showed them which offerings match the mood of a shrine and which gestures bring calm instead of show. He stayed close to the shoreline, where the scent of salt reminded him of his mistake and kept his humility sharp, and where he could speak freely of lantern fish and coral halls without fear of laughter. As for Toyotama, the sea princess who walked away into the tide, she did not forget. Songs say that on certain nights, when the moon burned silver on the waves, she rose onto the sand in her true draconic form. The long, elegant body of a creature shaped by water's strength, but moving with the memory of womanhood. From a distance, she would watch the child who played at the edge of the tide. Most children fled at the sight of her. His did not. He looked up, smiled at her vast shadow, and returned to his game. And sometimes this is how an ancient wound begins to heal. Toyotama went back to her coral chambers and listened to the gossip of sand crabs, creatures as talkative as any noblewoman, who told her how her son grew. She lived her days with the quiet dignity of queens who have known hurt, filling rooms with silence deep enough to cradle an invisible cradle. Tamvyori, her younger sister, kept the house on land. She is not a blazing figure in the earliest poems, yet without her the entire line would collapse. She fed the child what needed feeding. She corrected what needed correcting. She carried to him the blessings passed from a sea that still respected the one who had broken its rule. That is a kind of grace much older and stronger than resentment. When the years allowed it, she married him. Their union wove the scattered threads of two worlds into a new fabric. Some traditions give the names of all four sons. Only one matters to the great movement of the story. A boy who would beget a leader whose journey east would turn myth into monarchy. The sea palace remained hidden under blue depths, still attentive to news whispered by mullet and eel. The tide jewels rested like sleeping thoughts in a drawer, to be touched only when necessity came wearing clean shoes. The brothers who once fumed and quarreled had learned humility. The father who once mediated had lived to see peace where there had been danger. And Konohana, the blossom bride of Ninigi, watched her grandchildren with a soft acceptance of the mortal span she had chosen. Brevity, she understood better than anyone, can be kind. Yugia Fukyu, the child born of a broken vow, slept beneath a roof where sea salt and mountain loam balanced each other in the air. When he grew, he walked as children walk when careful hands have steadied them from infancy. He learned to bow at thresholds, to listen to old men repeat the same tale with new endings, to honor silence as much as speech. He married Tamvyori when the years allowed propriety, and from their union came 4 sons who would turn the hinge of the island's future. The eldest, Itsus, was strong of arm and brave of shoulder. Izanagi felt the pull of the ocean in his dreams and one day followed it back to the halls of the Sea King. Maiknu was a hunter shaped by rugged paths. And the youngest, Kamoyamato Iwerbiko, would one day be remembered as Jimmu, the man who carried the lineage of heaven eastward and set down the first capital. By this time, the land shaped by Ninigi had ripened. Rice fields lay like open manuscripts. Shrines brushed the dawn with light. Stories moved under the surface of daily life the way water moves beneath rice roots, quiet, steady, essential. But there was a feeling in the air, a soft collective breath waiting to be released. The sense that the line that began with a mirror, a jewel, and a serpent-born sword now needed a seat, a center, a name written not in myth but in soil. Iwerbiko was not the loudest of the brothers. He listened to omens, to elders, to the quiet murmur of gods in the leaves. He looked east. There, the land of Yamato spread valleys that welcomed rule and mountains that sheltered dreams. There, he was told, lay the heart of the nation waiting to be born. So the brothers gathered men who trusted roads more than raids. They built boats sturdy in rib and spirit, loaded them with household gods and provisions, and set out across the sea. The waters greeted them with a long, slow lift, as if acknowledging the gravity of the journey. They reached Naniwa, where river and sea forgotten their quarrels and embraced. There stood Nagasuni Hiko, a chieftain proud in local power, sharp in suspicion toward strangers whose authority came from the sky. Words met like blades, then blades met like storms. One arrow found Itsus's ribs, ending a life that had once burned with promise. The brothers mourned, and they withdrew not in defeat but in understanding. Iwerbiko knew that sometimes a god closes one road only to open another. They turned south, skirting the coast until they reached Kumano, where mountains leaned close and ancient forests whispered in the language of shrines older than kings. There an enchanted sleep fell upon them, never mere weariness in stories like these, but a test. In the dream of Takakuragi, a humble keeper of storehouses, a thunder god appeared, Take Mikazuchi, the straight-handed deity of justice. He placed a sword in the man's dream and a command in his heart. Give this blade to the leader who lies asleep. It will break the spell. It will open his road. Takakuragi woke and found the sword not just in memory but in his storehouse, as if thought had condensed into iron. He carried it to Iwerbiko. The young leader received it with the solemn respect due to a god who gives not just victory but restraint. And with that, the road eastward began to clear. The sleep that had wrapped the company at Kumano slipped from them like a badly fitted cloak. One breath they were wrapped in heaviness, the next they were awake under a pale sky, as if the world itself had decided they were ready to move again. From the coast they turned inland. Mist rose from the rivers in long white sleeves, drifting between trunks and stones as if the mountains themselves were exhaling. In that half-light, something waited for them on a boulder beside the path. A bird. Not ordinary. It had 3 legs and it stood with the quiet arrogance of an envoy who knows it will be believed. This was Yatagarasu, the 3-legged crow, an omen old enough that even skeptics lower their voices around its name. The bird did not speak. It did not need to. It leapt into the air, flew a short distance, and perched. When the company reached it, it flew again, further this time up a ravine, along a ridge, over a shoulder of rock that looked like the folded arm of a sleeping giant. Step by step, in this strange stop-and-go procession, the crow drew them onto the inner plane of Yamato. The men walked with the strange ease of those who know they are not lost, who feel, on some level, that a hand rests invisibly on their shoulders, steering them. The land itself seemed to lean closer. Valleys opened to receive them the way a house opens for a long-absent heir. At last, Yatagarasu climbed higher, then turned into a curve of black against the light and vanished into the face of the sun. The sky watched, the path lay open, but the plain was not empty. Nagasunihiko still stood as a thorn in the side of this unfolding story, a chieftain who had planted his own claims on the land and did not intend to kneel to a stranger whose authority came from the clouds. Once again, steel and will collided. The sword that had descended from the realm of thunder, the blade given through a dream in a storehouse, showed its nature. Iwerbiko did not boast. He did not shout. As he moved with the grim clarity of someone who knows the cost of turning back. When the fighting broke, he pressed forward and broke the enemy line. Nagasunihiko's hold on the plain cracked like ice under spring weight and then gave way. When the dust settled, Iwerbiko did not stand over corpses and gloat. He turned to the hills and the rivers. He offered thanks. For victory in such stories is never only about defeating a man. It is about receiving permission from the land itself to stay. On a stretch of earth that lay calm and level, as if it had been patiently prepared by hands unseen, he raised his seat at Kashihara. There, tradition says, he became the first emperor, not just a war leader, but a man whose throne could point backward through a long corridor of gods and forward into the fragile, stubborn lives of mortals. The age of gods did not vanish. It simply placed a hand on the shoulder of the age of men, and together they took a first step. From this point, the story walks less often in the forges of heaven and the palaces beneath the sea. It begins to move instead through camps and markets, through rice fields and timber halls. It follows rulers who carry the sun in their ancestry, and yet must still worry about roads muddying, granaries cracking, and tax ledgers refusing to balance. In shrine after shrine, priests placed the mirror, the jewel, and the sword in places of honor. They taught that good rule must reflect like the mirror, bind and connect like the curved beads of the Magatama, and only defend with the sword as a last, reluctant answer. And children traced their shapes in dust and in the air. Kings listened to the soft sermon of ropes and thresholds. Be careful where you cross. Be mindful of what you open. From this young imperial line rose a figure whose name moves through songs like a cold gust across still water. Yamato Takeru, the brave of Yamato, he was not gentle. He was not meant to be. He was the son of a later sovereign, Emperor Keiko, a boy forged in the dangerous furnace of strength without calm. In his youth, he killed a rough cousin by deceit, an act no priest would bless, a deed that hung around his shoulders like smoke. But his path was never toward the throne in Kashihara. His road ran along the neglected edges, into places where order failed and wildness bloomed like mold in corners. That is where the realm needed him. The first story that clings to him belongs to the south. In Kumaso, two brothers ruled like wolves with crowns. They took without asking, they carved tacks from bone. Their cruelty became a proverb. The court did not send an army, it sent a single prince. Yamato Takeru did not arrive under standards and marching drums. He put on the garments of a woman, soft folds, hair arranged as if for a festival. He entered the chieftain's hall among dancers and attendants, a beautiful stranger whose presence made no one reach for a spear because pride had made their eyes lazy. He sat close, he waited. When the hour grew late and the drink sat hot and heavy in his host's blood, he moved with the quickness of someone who had done this terrible thing before. He leaned toward the elder brother, and from beneath his robe he drew a blade that had many times tasted the dark. One stroke, then another. Strength had no time to gather. The younger died soon after. as easily as a candlepin knocked down by the second ball. The elder, bleeding into the mat he had expected to warm for many more nights, gave him a parting gift more heavy than any treasure. "You are the true brave of Yamato," he said. "Take the name, leave this house to silence." The prince accepted the title like a cloak cut from someone else's shadow. He would wear it and it would never be light. From the south, the story turns east. There, the forests were thick, the rivers stubborn, and rebellion had taken root in the spaces between shrines. Yamato Takeru went out like a drawn arrow. Before he departed, he went to see his aunt Yamato Hime, priestess of the sun at Ise. She did not embrace him as an indulgent relative. She received him as a guardian of duty. Into his hands she placed the serpent-born sword, the blade recovered from the tail of Orochi, the same sword that had once mended a rift between storm and sunlight. With it she gave him a small pouch, light as breath and deadly as lightning, a magic tinder that would answer his call when his life hung in the balance. He bowed, understanding that he was not just being armed. He was being woven into the oldest patterns of his people. On the eastern plains, treachery tried to answer destiny. A local lord invited him to a hunt in high grasses. Men spread out through the reeds. For a while, it was only the sound of stalks brushing armor. Then the field sighed, and lines of fire sprang up where conspirators had laid them, forming a tightening ring of flame around the prince. The fire closed in with the smug joy of a snare. Yamato Takeru did not panic. He stood his ground, drew the serpent blade, and swept a wide arc through the grass around his feet. The cut opened a gap. Then he took the pouch from Issei. He kindled his own line of fire and whispered to the wind god, "Carry this, not that." The wind, as winds sometimes do in the presence of certain names, obeyed. It grabbed his fire and hurled it outward. The two blazes met treacheries and answers, and wrestled each other into a red, confused struggle without direction. Through that confusion, the prince slipped. Smoke closed behind him like a closing hand. He found the one who had summoned him to that false hunt, and settled an account so thoroughly that no later court would need to revisit it. There were other tests. He took ships along saw-toothed coasts and forced riverside strongholds to lower their arrogance. He fought a boar too large and too strange to be merely animal, and left its tusks wedged into a tree as a warning to anyone who mistook pride for skill. He climbed Mount Ibuki, where the god of that peak wore storms like garments. The prince, swollen with past victories, thought to treat the mountain as he had treated smaller foes, with disdain and a raised sword. The mountain god answered with cold. Ice and vapor hammered him from the sky, beating his strength down into the ground. He staggered for days, his body carrying a crack like fine pottery, beautiful still, but never again whole enough to ring the same way when struck. Heroes in these tales are never given immortality. They are given enough time for one more necessary task. Worn and altered, Yamato Takeru reached the shrine at Atsuta, where the air seems always ready for ceremony. There, he did something more radical than another killing. He let go. He returned the serpent sword. No longer a weapon in his hand, it became a relic, a story given a house of its own. Even a prince can grow tired of carrying legends around like armor. He crossed more ranges, sat by more river mouths. He thought of a wife in the east whose patience could quiet warriors. He turned his steps homeward, not escorted by massed armies now, but by a quieter acknowledgement. The sickness walked beside him. On a plain near Ise, his strength sagged like a banner in a wind that had simply lost interest. He spoke of a white bird that had visited his dreams, a shape that seemed to wait for him just beyond waking. He lay down in the grass and the land took the exact measure of him. When he died, the air sharpened for a moment, the way it does when something significant departs. His companions built him a tomb shaped like a low hill and placed Haniwa upon it, clay figures turned outward, watching the fields, guarding the boundary between story and soil. Then, as the old tales say, a white bird rose from the mound. It flew across marsh and inlet, searching for the place where grief and sky could meet halfway. The mourners followed until the bird settled, and there they marked his final resting. In that white arc of wings, sorrow found a shape it could live with. If you listen closely to this chapter, you can hear an entire culture deciding what it wants courage to mean. It is not just muscle, it is skill. It is disguise when open war would only close doors. It is the wisdom to hand a sword to a shrine and walk away lighter. It is the understanding that fire can save a life when set carefully and erase a village when set carelessly. It is also the humility to accept that even the sharpest edge cannot cut through the oldest law of all, that every life has an end. The prince who did not flinch before boar, traitor, or mountain path could not outface the cold sent by a god he had mocked. His death left the country with more than a string of victories. It left a pattern, a way to measure the rightful use of force and the point at which a man must bow to limits. Back in Kashihara, the line that claimed the sun as ancestress continued. Priests kept the mirror bright, the jewel safe, and reminded each new ruler that the sword is drawn last, not first. Each spring, the fields looked up and silently asked, "Can we trust the hands that turn us?" More often than not, the answer was yes, because those hands remembered. They remembered a heavenly grandson stepping down with mirror, jewel, and sword. They remembered a leader who followed a three-legged crow into the heart of a country. They remembered a prince who once cut a path through flame and later let a spirit bird carry his last name into the sky. These are large signs. But they teach small daily lessons, bow at thresholds, keep promises made beside the sea, let laughter into serious rooms, ask a mountain's permission before you climb its pride. The age of gods had already taught the rhythm of creation, loss, and return. The age of emperors added law and memory and the long patience of records. Together, they became not just stories, but sentences a people repeats to itself when storms wake and seasons turn. And somewhere in those sentences, under shrine ropes thick as rivers and beneath tomb mounds where clay figures face the fields, the story of Japanese mythology continues to breathe, quietly, steadily, waiting for the next listener to close their eyes and follow it into the dark.